Chapter 2198. Yes. Hearing the coldness in Jian Ni's voice, Gu Qianjun retreated to the side obediently. In this assessment, no one could go against Jian Ni. Not to mention that there were many seals in the Shang sword sect ruins that could easily kill Gu Qianjun. The strength that Jian Ni displayed was not something that Gu Qianjun could resist. Who's next? Seeing that Gu Qianjun had retreated to the side, Jian Ni looked at the crowd and said, "Me." Sword Sage Qin took a step forward and came to the side of the sword test stone. A surge of sword essence condensed in his palm, and he slammed it on the sword test stone. On the sword test stone, sword essence burst forth and the first level started to light up. Next was the second level and the third level. Enlightened Sword Qin's sword will merely stopped at the third level before disappearing. Seeing the result, no one was surprised. In terms of strength, Gu Qianjun was above Sword Sage Qin. Sword Sage Qin was considered lucky to be able to come this far. After all, Blood Shadow Swordmaster, who was stronger than Sword Sage Qin, had died in the passageway. Sword Sage Qin's face turned pale when he saw the result. However, he could only stand aside. Next, without Jian Ni shouting, someone took the initiative and came to the sword test stone to take the assessment. Flying Sword Emperor was the third to take the assessment. He condensed his sword essence and injected it into the sword test stone. Suddenly, 5 levels of the sword test stone were lit up. This number surpassed Sword Sage Qin and Gu Qianjun. This result made Gu Qianjun and Sword Enlightened Qin even more embarrassed, especially Sword Enlightened Qin. If there was anyone who surpassed him, he would definitely be eliminated this time. Once one was eliminated, one could only die or become a slave. These were the two paths. The next person was Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer. He came to the sword test stone and injected his sword essence into it. Suddenly, the 4th level of the sword test stone was lit up. Even the 5th level of the sword test stone was shining brightly. Just as the 5th level was about to be lit up, Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer's sword essence suddenly disappeared. His results stopped at the 4th level, the same as Gu Qianjun. Seeing this, Gu Qianjun let out a sigh of relief. If Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer surpassed him, he would be in great danger. Now that their results were the same, there was still a chance. Only Immortal Sword Qin's face had already turned pale. He clearly knew that he had failed the trial. Only Chu Fengmian, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, and Xian Songtian were left. Putting aside Chu Fengmian, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was a famous expert. His strength was unfathomable, and from his performance in the previous rounds, it could be seen how powerful the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor would definitely surpass him. As for Xian Songtian, he came from the top sword sect of the 9 regions, the Tianjian sect. There was no need to doubt his sword Dao. As for Chu Fengmian, even if his grades weren't as good as his, it wouldn't change anything. "Brother Shenmu, you first or I first?" Xian Songtian looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and asked after the Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer test was completed. He completely ignored Chu Fengmian, who was beside him. "I'll go first." The Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not decline and directly took a step forward. He arrived in front of the sword testing stone and placed his hand on the sword testing stone. Immediately, a shocking sword intent erupted from the sword testing stone. The strength of the sword intent far surpassed any of the previous sword intent. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the sword testing stone. Starting from the 1st level, the dazzling light kept rising. The 1st level, the 2nd level, the 3rd level, the 4th level, the 5th level. Among the 4 of them, the best result was the Flying Sword Emperor's 5th level. However, the light soon lit up the 5th level. It wasn't over yet. The light rushed to an even higher level and soon reached the 6th level. The 6th level, seeing the 6th level lit up, everyone was extremely shocked. Everyone knew how difficult the sword testing stone was, but the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had lit up the 6th level in an instant. Moreover, the sword intent did not disappear. Instead, it continued to rush to an even higher level. The 7th level? Oh my God! Seeing that the 7th level of the sword testing stone was lit up, many people's eyes were filled with envy and jealousy. To be able to light up the 7th level of the sword testing stone was enough to prove how powerful the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was. The stronger the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was, the greater the chance he had to obtain the final inheritance. On the sword testing stone, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's sword intent rushed up after lighting up the 7th level. Even the 8th level started to be lit up a little. However, charging to the 7th level was almost the limit of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. The 8th level was only lit up a little and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's sword intent disappeared. The result stopped at the 7th level. The result was already extremely shocking. It surpassed the Flying Sword Emperor, who was previously ranked first by 2 levels. The 7th level? The Divine Wood Sword Emperor also raised his head and took a look at the result. He couldn't help but mutter to himself. It was unknown if he was satisfied or dissatisfied with the result. However, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had already lit up the 7th level of the sword testing stone. It was already certain that he would pass the test this time. Not bad. Jian and I, who was standing in the air and looking at everyone from afar, looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and said. His eyes revealed a satisfied expression. The feeling that Jian and I gave off previously had always been extremely cold. However, he praised the Divine Wood Sword Emperor at that moment. This made everyone's heart turn cold, especially the Flying Sword Emperor and the others. They looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor as though they were facing a great enemy. If the Divine Wood Sword Emperor really obtained the final inheritance, all of their efforts would be in vain. Kid, I'll let you go first. Xian Songtian looked at Chu Fengmian and said coldly. Xian Songtian wasn't as courteous to Chu Fengmian as he was to the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. Everyone in the 9 regions knew about the grudge between the Sword Dao sect and the Tianjian sect. Moreover, more than 1 or 2 Sword Dao sect disciples had died in Chu Fengmian's hands. At that moment, Xian Songtian didn't need to conceal his hostility anymore. Let me go first? Chu Fengmian couldn't help but reveal a smile when he heard Xian Songtian's words. If I go first, I'm afraid it will shatter the pride in your heart. It's better for you to go first. Shatter the pride in my heart. Xian Songtian's face revealed a cold expression when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. He snorted coldly. Xian Songtian was a rare genius in the Tianjian sect. He wasn't the sect master, but he made an exception to cultivate the celestial sword technique. He even made the Tianjian sect pay a huge price to obtain an upper sword execution chart. This was how highly the Tianjian sect valued him. Chapter 2199. In the Tianjian sect, no one was Xian Songtian's match in terms of sword principle comprehension. Even the old antiques in the Tianjian sect were not as good as him. This was Xian Songtian's pride, his pride. That was why Xian Songtian let the others go first. He wanted to be the last one to amaze the world. However, Chu Fengmian's words had guessed his thoughts, and he was even despised by Chu Fengmian. Xian Songtian's face darkened as he stared at Chu Fengmian with murderous intent in his eyes. The murderous intent in his heart was displayed without any concealment. He wanted to kill Chu Fengmian. All right, I'll let you live a little longer. You're just struggling at death's door. I'd like to see how long you can drag it out. Xian Songtian snorted coldly as he took a step forward and came before the sword test stone. His face instantly calmed down, and he did not seem as angry as he was when he was talking to Chu Fengmian. Everyone nodded at the change in his demeanor. To become a peerless expert, the most important thing was a Dao heart. A Dao heart that would remain calm even if Mount Tai collapsed in front of him. Even if he was angry just now, he would be able to sober up immediately. Kid, don't think that you can be proud just because you inherited the inheritance of the sword principal master. The gap between you and me is huge. The upper sword sect inheritance belongs to me. Xian Songtian sneered as he looked at Chu Fengmian. He was clearly provoking Chu Fengmian. However, the confidence in his words also meant that Xian Songtian was confident that he would obtain the upper sword sect inheritance no matter what. Boom! As he spoke, Xian Songtian's sword essence condensed on his palm. The moment his palm touched the sword test stone, a shocking sword essence shot up into the sky from the sword test stone. The sword essence shot up into the sky and was extremely far away. Everyone was shocked when they felt the power contained within it. The sword essence in the sword test stone was even stronger than the sword essence that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had just unleashed. Even the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's originally calm expression changed slightly. Originally, everyone thought that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was the strongest among all the sword cultivators present. As for Xian Songtian, he seemed to be on par with the Flying Sword Emperor on the surface. However, no one expected Xian Songtian's sword essence to reach such a shocking level. Shocking everyone. Such a deep concealment. The Flying Sword Emperor mumbled to himself. The strength that Xian Songtian had displayed was not weak, but he had not expected that he had hidden such strength. In terms of sword essence alone, Xian Songtian had already surpassed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor in terms of sword principal attainments. Such a fast speed! A cry of surprise pulled everyone back from their thoughts as they hurriedly looked at the sword testing stone. Layers upon layers of the sword testing stone were lit up instantly. In an instant, the first 5 layers of the sword testing stone were all lit up. It had surpassed the Flying Sword Emperor in an instant. Of level. The 8th floor. This sword intent erupted from the sword testing stone and rose steadily, reaching an even higher level. In just a few breaths of time, even the 8th level of the sword testing stone was completely lit up. 8th floor. The 8th floor is lit up. Everyone was shocked when they saw the scene. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor had lit up the 7th floor and it had already shocked everyone. But now, Xian Songtian was even stronger than the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. He had lit up the 8th floor and surpassed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. In terms of strength, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor might be stronger. However, Xian Songtian had already surpassed him in terms of sword principle. The gap between each floor of the sword test stone was extremely huge. Such a gap might not be able to be made up with strength. The sword essence has not disappeared. Could it be that Xian Songtian wants to light up the 9th floor? Kungsu Sky Piercer, Gu Qianjun and the others looked at the sword test stone and exclaimed. After the 8th floor of the sword test stone was completely lit up, Xian Songtian's sword essence did not disappear. Instead, it continued to charge and the 9th floor of the sword test stone was lit up bit by bit. Although no one had tried the 9th floor of the sword test stone before, they could imagine the difficulty from the previous floors. For example, Sword Sage Qin could be considered as one of the best among the immortal generals. Only the 3rd floor was lit up. Kungsu Sky Piercer and Gu Qianjun were only at the 4th floor. Now that Xian Songtian was about to light up the 9th floor, everyone fell silent. Unparalleled sword principle. These words were used to describe Xian Songtian. On the 9th floor of the sword test stone, Xian Songtian's sword essence was still charging up, trying to light up the 9th floor completely. The 9th floor was lit up bit by bit. 80%. More than half of the 9th floor of the sword test stone was lit up. However, everyone could feel that Xian Songtian's sword essence had reached its limit and could dissipate at any time. Xian Songtian's sword essence had also reached its limit. Just as the 9th floor of the sword test stone was lit up, Xian Songtian's sword essence could not take it anymore and dissipated. The sword test stone's light gradually dimmed. 8th floor. It's a pity. Just a little bit more. Everyone sighed when they saw the scene. Xian Songtian was just a step away from lighting up the 9th floor. At the last step, his sword essence was exhausted and he could only stop at the 8th floor. However, the result of the 8th floor was already extremely shocking, and he firmly occupied the top spot. One should know that when the Divine Wood Sword Emperor lit up the 7th floor, Jian and I praised him, and he was extremely satisfied. Now, Xian Songtian had far surpassed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. Such talent is extremely rare in the ancient era. Very good, very good. Jian and I looked at Xian Songtian and said with a smile. His evaluation was even higher than Xian Songtian's not bad previously. Only the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian can compete for the upper sword sex inheritance. Such a thought appeared in everyone's minds. This test had finally begun in front of everyone. For example, although the Flying Sword Emperor had a chance, it was already extremely difficult. As for Sword Sage Qin and the others, their faces were as pale as ashes. They already knew that the inheritance test had nothing to do with them anymore. 8th floor. Seems like it's still a little bit more. Xian Songtian raised his head and took a look at the result. He then turned his head and looked at Chu Fengmian. His eyes were cold as he said arrogantly, "Kid, didn't you want to crush my pride? I would like to see if you can do it." End of chapter. Chapter 2200. Xian Songtian was full of confidence when he saw that Su Imo had stopped at the 8th level. This was a result that even the Divine Wood Sword Emperor could not surpass. Xian Songtian stared at Chu Fengmian and said coldly, "Even the Master of the Sword Principle died at the hands of the Tianjian sect. You have only inherited a portion of the Sword Principle sect's inheritance. I would like to see if you can crush my pride." Xian Songtian did not hide the sarcasm in his voice as he looked at Chu Fengmian with a superior attitude. Everyone's eyes were now on Chu Fengmian. Among all the people present, only Chu Fengmian had not taken the test. "Kid, don't tell me you're scared?" Gu Qianjun mocked when he saw that Chu Fengmian had not moved. "Kid, if you don't dare, then kill yourself now. Don't waste any more time." Xian Songtian stared at Chu Fengmian and said sternly, "Oh? It's only the 8th level. Is it worth being so proud of?" Chu Fengmian slowly opened his eyes when he heard this. He glanced at Xian Songtian and said with a disdainful smile, "It seems that you are more useless than I thought. Your tongue is nothing. I would like to see if you can surpass me." Xian Songtian sneered. He retreated to the side and left the space in front of the sword test stone empty. "It's only the 8th level." Chu Fengmian looked relaxed. He lifted his foot and slowly walked towards the sword test stone. He looked at the sword test stone and said with a smile, "Look carefully. It's only the 8th level. It's not worth mentioning in front of me." As Chu Fengmian spoke, he placed his hand on the sword test stone and a sword essence flowed through it. Boom! A shocking sword essence burst out from the sword test stone. This shocking aura shot up to the 9 heavens. The entire square and even the entire upper sword sect ruins could feel this shocking sword essence clearly. Chu Fengmian's figure looked extremely majestic and noble above the sword essence. He stood in front of the sword test stone, but he had an aura of supremacy over the sword principle. On the sword testing stone, as Chu Fengmian's sword will poured in, several sword testing stones lit up in an instant. The speed was so fast that people couldn't see it clearly. 1st floor, 2nd floor, 3rd floor. This strand of sword intent violently charged forward. It was as if the trials of the sword testing stone didn't have any pressure in front of Chu Fengmian's strand of sword intent. 5th level, 6th level. The 7th floor. In the blink of an eye, Chu Fengmian's sword intent had lit up the 8th level of the sword testing stone. All of this happened in an instant. Chu Fengmian had already lit up the 8th level. In terms of results, He was already on equal footing with Xian Songtian. At the sight of this, everyone was dumbfounded. The shock in their hearts was indescribable. Previously, the speed of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian had already shocked them. But now, Chu Fengmian's sword intent had directly reached the 8th level of the sword testing stone. Moreover, everyone could clearly feel that Chu Fengmian's sword intent didn't seem to consume any energy at all. The first 8 levels of the sword testing stone were targets that countless celestial realm and even profound heaven realm sword cultivators would spend their entire lives trying to reach. Many sword Dao experts spent their entire lives, but their sword Dao was unable to light up the 8th level of the sword testing stone. But now, Chu Fengmian had achieved all of this in an instant. Even Chu Fengmian's expression was extremely relaxed, as if doing all of this was a very ordinary thing. Seeing that Chu Fengmian's sword intent had lit up the 8th level of the sword testing stone, Xian Songtian's expression changed drastically. In his heart, he had always been extremely arrogant. In fact, he hadn't even taken Chu Fengmian seriously from the beginning. In his opinion, if Chu Fengmian hadn't inherited the sword principal sex inheritance, he wouldn't even be qualified to compete with him on the same stage. Even though Chu Fengmian had come to the upper sword sex ruins, he had never taken Chu Fengmian seriously or treated him as an opponent. But now, the scene in front of him had severely shattered his arrogance. He was now looking forward to seeing the limit of Chu Fengmian's sword intent stop at the 8th level. But in the next moment, his expectations were dashed. After lighting up the 8th level, Chu Fengmian's sword intent rushed to an even higher level. The 9th level of the sword testing stone was instantly lit up. The 9th level. Countless people held their breaths as they watched this scene. No one had expected that Chu Fengmian would actually surpass everyone and reach the 9th level. Among everyone present, Chu Fengmian was the only one who could reach the 9th level. This was a scene that no one had dared to imagine from the beginning. When he saw that Chu Fengmian's sword intent had lit up the 9th level, Xian Songtian's expression was extremely miserable. His hopes had been completely dashed. The moment Chu Fengmian's sword intent lit up the 9th level of the sword testing stone, it had also completely shattered his arrogance. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor's gaze was fixed on Chu Fengmian. His gaze seemed to want to see through everything about Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian stood beside the sword testing stone. His expression was extremely relaxed as he even raised his head to take a look at the result. The 9th level doesn't seem to be low, Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. He was so relaxed that it seemed as though lighting up the 9th level of the sword testing stone was an extremely easy task for him. If you can light up more than 10 levels, the upper sword sect will reward you handsomely. At this moment, Jian and I, who had been silent all this while, suddenly descended from the sky and came to Chu Fengmian's side as he spoke slowly. Such a scene shocked the crowd once again. Jian and I could be said to be a man of few words previously. Only when the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian lit up the 7th and 8th levels respectively did he speak. But now, Jian and I suddenly spoke before Chu Fengmian had even finished his assessment. Furthermore, from Jian Ni's words, his expectations for Chu Fengmian were not just limited to the 9th level. Could this person really be able to break through to the 10th level? Impossible, the 10th level? Is this really something that a half-step celestial being realm sword cultivator can break through? Disbelieving gazes fell on Chu Fengmian one after another. If Chu Fengmian was an invincible sword cultivator and an immortal emperor, then naturally no one would doubt that Chu Fengmian could break through to the 10th level. However, Chu Fengmian's cultivation realm was clearly only at the half-step celestial being realm. From the beginning, everyone felt that Chu Fengmian was a little strange. However, no one had ever felt that Chu Fengmian was a true expert and a true opponent for them. However, Chu Fengmian had already lit up the 9th level of the sword testing stone and was not far from the 10th level. End of chapter. Chapter 2201. Sword Dao Sect. Sword Dao Sect. It seems like we have underestimated him. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor muttered to himself. He had already made his decision on whether Chu Fengmian could break through to the 10th level. Chu Fengmian had already broken through to the 9th level, and he looked so relaxed. The 10th level was no longer a challenge for Chu Fengmian. There's a reward? Why didn't you say so earlier? You wouldn't have wasted so much time if you had said so earlier. Chu Fengmian revealed a smile when he heard Jian Ni's words. He looked at Xian Songtian and said casually, "That's right, Xian Songtian. You're just breaking through to the 8th level and you're already so proud. Watch carefully. I've already said that you're not worthy to be my opponent." The moment Chu Fengmian spoke casually, a burst of sword intent burst out from his palm and entered the sword testing stone again. Suddenly, the light that had quieted down in the sword testing stone was revealed again. The shocking sword intent rushed up and the 10th level of the sword testing stone was instantly lit up. The dazzling light stimulated everyone's eyes. The 10th level. He really reached the 10th level. The dazzling light that erupted from the 10th level of the sword testing stone was enough to make everyone aghast. It hasn't stopped yet. What? But at this moment someone suddenly noticed. Chu Fengmian's sword intent didn't stop after breaking through to the 10th level. It continued to break through to the 11th level. Rumble! From the sword testing stone, a shocking sword intent burst out. It was as if two forces were clashing within it. The shockwaves from the collision of the two forces from the sword testing stone sent chills down everyone's spines. The 10th level wasn't Chu Fengmian's limit. Numerous gazes were fixed on Chu Fengmian. It was only at this moment that the crowd seemed to truly understand Chu Fengmian. Xian Songtian's eyes were wide open when he saw Chu Fengmian light up the 10th level. His mouth was slightly agape, but he couldn't make a single sound. Boom! On the 11th level of the sword test stone, Chu Fengmian's sword intent expanded rapidly and lit up the entire floor. The sword intent of thousands of swordsmanship in the ancient swordsmanship book created by Chu Fengmian burst out. How many sword techniques has this person cultivated? Thousands? Tens of thousands? Seeing Chu Fengmian's sword intent, the Flying Sword Emperor muttered to himself. All the sword cultivators present had been famous for a long time. Many of them were famous in the extraterritorial starry sky. When they saw Chu Fengmian's sword will, they also saw the various sword techniques in it. But now, Chu Fengmian's sword intent contained thousands or even tens of thousands of swordsmanship. How could a single person integrate so many swordsmanship into his own swordsmanship? This was simply an impossible task. It broke the understanding of the sword Dao that all the sword cultivators present had towards the sword Dao. Even the hearts of many people were shaken. The sword Dao that they had always persevered in their hearts was shaken. Boom! 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 Just at this moment, waves of sword intent burst out. The sword intent swept across the heavens and the earth. The entire sky was occupied by the sword intent. The entire square had turned into a world of swords. The sword intent was enough to affect a world. The 10th level. The 11th level of the sword test stone was lit up under everyone's gaze. It burst out with dazzling light that made it hard for people to open their eyes. But now, countless gazes were staring at the dazzling light. They did not dare to shift their gazes away. They were in disbelief. But now, they had confirmed that the 11th level of the sword test stone was lit up by Chu Fengmian. It's the 10th level. How long has it been? How long has it been since there was a successor who could reach the 11th level of the sword test stone? Jian Ni's gaze was looking at Chu Fengmian, who lit up the 11th level. His eyes were filled with nostalgia and a little moist. After thousands of years, the Shang sword sect had changed, and he was the only one alive. He had to choose the successor of the Shang sword sect. The 10th level. Even in the ancient era, when the Shang sword sect dominated the world, there were only a few sword cultivator geniuses who could achieve such a result. The 10th level was already extremely outstanding in his eyes. Once he inherited the inheritance of the Shang sword sect, he would have the hope of revitalizing the Shang sword sect in the future. As for the 11th level, Jian and I did not dare to imagine it in the current era. But today, Chu Fengmian had actually achieved it. Could it be that this person is going to obtain the inheritance directly? No, we must stop him. Jian Ni's expression was seen by everyone, especially the Flying Sword Emperor, Gu Qianjun and the others. Their eyes were filled with killing intent. Judging from Jian Ni's attitude towards Chu Fengmian, the inheritance of the Shang sword sect would most likely fall into Chu Fengmian's hands. Even if they passed this test, they would not be able to compete with Chu Fengmian in the next test. Kill! 2 pairs of eyes exchanged glances, and a wisp of killing intent was gathering. On the other side, Chu Fengmian did not care about it at all. He was fully focused on the sword test stone. He wanted to use the sword test stone to see what level his sword principle had reached. Although the 11th level was shocking enough, it was far from enough for Chu Fengmian. 9 regions. Chu Fengmian chanted in his heart. The strongest sword intent that belonged to Chu Fengmian, the 9 regions sword principle, was unleashed. In the sword test stone, Chu Fengmian's sword intent did not stop after lighting up the 11th level. Instead, it rushed to the 12th level. The 10th level is still not the limit? Could it be that he really wants to light up the entire 12th level of the sword test stone? Everyone was speechless when they saw Chu Fengmian's sword intent rushing to the 12th level of the sword test stone. They stared blankly at the scene. Such a result was absolutely impossible for them to achieve in their lifetime. The 12th level of the sword test stone was completely lit up. No one knew what would happen next. The 12th level. Could it be that he can really light up the 12th level? Even Jian Ni's eyes were filled with disbelief when he saw Chu Fengmian's sword intent rushing to the 12th level. He valued Chu Fengmian greatly from the beginning. Therefore, he had arranged for Chu Fengmian to enter the book collection pavilion to undergo the test. However, no matter how much he valued Chu Fengmian, he did not think that Chu Fengmian could reach the 12th level. End of chapter. Chapter 2202. No one knew better than Jian and I what the 12th floor of the sword test stone represented. It represented the pinnacle of sword Tao. Among the countless experts of the upper sword sect, there were only a few who could reach the 12th floor of the sword test stone. Almost all of them were unrivaled experts who had reached the pinnacle of the Immortal Emperor realm. Only sword cultivators who had reached the Immortal Emperor realm were qualified to light up the 12th floor of the sword test stone. This was an unchanging rule in the ancient era. No one had ever broken it. Even experts at the 8th level of the 9th Order Immortal Realm wouldn't be able to light up the 12th level of the sword test stone. To them, lighting up the 10th level of the sword test stone was their limit. There were countless sword cultivator geniuses in the upper sword sect, but the limit of these sword cultivator geniuses was the 11th floor. No one who hadn't reached the Sword Emperor realm could light up the 12th floor of the sword test stone. Jian and I thought highly of Chu Fengmian. However, according to his prediction, Chu Fengmian could only light up the 10th floor of the sword test stone. Chu Fengmian being able to light up the 11th floor was enough to surprise him. As for Chu Fengmian being able to light up the 12th floor, he had never thought of it. But now, Chu Fengmian's sword intent had already rushed into the 12th floor. The 12th floor of the sword test stone had already shown a kind of chaotic color, and it was extremely blurry. It represented the pinnacle of Sword Tao, the Immortal Emperor Sword Tao. Only sword cultivators who had reached the Immortal Emperor realm were qualified to light it up. And now, Chu Fengmian's sword intent had rushed into the 12th floor. Lighting up the 12th floor. Flying Sword Emperor Gu Qianjun and the others looked at Chu Fengmian with increasingly intense killing intent. Chu Fengmian's comprehension of Sword Dao had reached an incredible level to be able to light up the 12th floor of the sword test stone. At present, Chu Fengmian was only a half step into the celestial realm, but in terms of strength, he was not inferior to them at all. Once Chu Fengmian stepped into the celestial realm in the future, his strength would reach an incredible level. This was what Flying Sword Emperor Gu Qianjun didn't want to see. If this continued, the inheritance of the upper sword sect would most likely fall into Chu Fengmian's hands. It was not just the two of them. Even Xian Songtian's eyes were filled with murderous intent as he stared at Chu Fengmian. It was as if he could attack and kill Chu Fengmian at any moment. For a moment, the atmosphere became incomparably solemn. Chu Fengmian, on the other hand, was completely unaware of what was going on. His consciousness had entered the sword testing stone and was trying to break through to the 12th level. Chu Fengmian's sword will and his swordsmanship all burst out. This sword testing stone was the best opportunity to test Chu Fengmian's current swordsmanship. Chu Fengmian didn't hold back at all. As time passed, the sword testing stone on the 12th level lit up bit by bit. Within the chaos there were traces of dazzling light. Boom! A shocking sword radiance shot up from the sword testing rock. This sword radiance shot up to the 9 heavens and transformed into the shape of a divine sword. It was a divine sword that was tens of thousands of feet long. The divine sword was condensed from Chu Fengmian's sword intent. Boom! 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 The 12th level of the sword testing stone was illuminated by the sword intent. The 12th level of the sword testing stone was completely illuminated. This was something that only a sword cultivator immortal emperor could achieve. Now, Chu Fengmian had actually done it. Even though he was only a half-step celestial being, he was able to do it. He really did it. Jian and I was extremely shocked. Even with his experience, he couldn't calm down now. Chu Fengmian's strength had completely exceeded his imagination. The peak of Sword Dao. How is it possible that he has reached the peak of Sword Dao at such a young age? Could it be that he has reached the final step? Jian Ni's eyes were filled with horror as he stared at Chu Fengmian. The moment the 12th level of the sword testing stone was illuminated, the entire sword testing stone burst out with dazzling light. The light that burst out was countless times more dazzling than before. The entire square was shaking. The entire upper sword sect ruins was shaking crazily. What's going on? Everyone present was anxiously observing their surroundings. No one knew where this sudden tremor originated from. However, everyone knew that the sudden change was definitely related to Chu Fengmian. After all, there was a sudden change when Chu Fengmian illuminated the 12th level of the sword testing stone. Sir Jian and I, what's going on? Xian Songtian turned his head and asked Jian and I. It's none of your business. Be quiet and watch. Jian Ni's face was cold. He didn't even turn his head. His eyes were fixed on Chu Fengmian's direction as if he wanted to see everything that was happening. Yes. Jian Ni's tone made Xian Songtian a little angry. However, he didn't dare to provoke Jian and I at this time. He could only suppress his anger and look at Chu Fengmian. Soon, everyone understood the reason for the tremor. They saw that on the square, another stone tablet suddenly emerged from the ground. This stone tablet suddenly merged with the sword testing stone. The sword testing stone, which was originally 100 meters tall, suddenly grew even taller. At the top of the stone, there was suddenly another layer. The 13th level. The 12th level of the sword testing stone wasn't the limit. There was a 13th level. The 13th level. How long has it been? How long has it been since someone summoned the 13th level of the sword testing stone? Jian and I looked at the changes on the sword testing stone. His eyes were filled with nostalgia as he muttered to himself. For tens of millions of years, the 13th level of the sword testing stone had never appeared again after the upper sword sect fell from its peak. Today, he couldn't help but tear up when he saw it. The 12th level of the sword testing stone represented the peak of the sword Dao, the immortal Emperor sword Dao. The 13th level only represented one thing, the origin of the sword Dao. Chu Fengmian's sword Dao had surpassed the immortal Emperor sword Dao and the peak. The origin of the sword Dao? Chu Fengmian raised his head and looked at the changes on the sword testing stone. He was very clear about what the 13th level of the sword testing stone represented. The origin of the sword Dao is worthy of my full effort. Chu Fengmian looked at the 13th level of the sword testing stone. With a thought, the sword intent suddenly burst out from the 12th level and rushed towards the 13th level of the sword testing stone. End of chapter. Chapter 2203. Sword Dao origin was the pinnacle of all sword cultivators and the ultimate goal of all sword cultivators. Among all the sword cultivators in the past, not even immortal emperors or sovereigns had reached this step. Today, Chu Fengmian was going to use his sword Dao to attack the sword Dao origin. Buzz. Chu Fengmian's sword intent rushed into the 13th level and felt an unprecedented pressure. Chu Fengmian felt extremely relaxed when he tried to break through the 12th level. However, Chu Fengmian felt an immense pressure the moment his sword intent rushed into the 13th level. The pressure made it difficult for Chu Fengmian's sword intent to move. Sword Dao origin is completely different from the pinnacle of sword Dao. In an instant, Chu Fengmian clearly felt the terror of the sword Dao origin. It was no wonder that countless immortal emperor sword cultivators in the past had never reached the sword Dao origin. Even the current Chu Fengmian couldn't compare to the profoundness of the sword Dao origin. However, even if I can't fully comprehend the sword Dao origin, I don't believe that I can't light up the 13th level. Chu Fengmian knew that he couldn't fully comprehend the sword Dao origin, but it wasn't impossible for him to comprehend a part of it. Compared to other sword cultivators and even many immortal emperor sword cultivators, Chu Fengmian had an advantage. It was the incomplete sword technique that he had comprehended from the sword Dao totem. The content of the incomplete sword technique was related to the sword Dao origin. Chu Fengmian had comprehended the incomplete sword technique, which allowed his sword technique to improve and surpass his previous life. Now, Chu Fengmian had integrated the various mysteries of the incomplete sword technique into the ancient book of Sword Dao. Explode. Thousands of sword intent burst out from Chu Fengmian's body and fiercely attacked the 13th level of the sword testing stone. Under the unprecedented pressure, Chu Fengmian's sword intent entered and burst out. In the 13th level of the sword testing stone, there was a little light that gradually lit up in the originally deep chaos. What? He can light up the 13th level a little? How is this possible? Jian and I was completely stunned at the sight. The 13th level represented the origin of the sword Dao. If one wanted to light it up a little, one would have to at least reach the pinnacle of the sword Dao or even comprehend a little of the sword Dao's origin. Only then would it be possible to light up the 13th level. This was something that many immortal emperors couldn't do. In history, only the Lord of the Sword Dao, the number 1 sword emperor, had 1 foot in the origin of the sword Dao. Only he was able to light up a tiny bit of the 13th level. Now, Chu Fengmian actually had 1 foot in the sword Dao origin. Jian and I couldn't imagine it at all. However, just as Jian and I was in shock, that flash of light disappeared completely. Under the immense pressure of the 13th layer of the sword testing stone, Chu Fengmian's sword intent was completely crushed and disappeared. The light on the sword testing stone also dimmed. Chu Fengmian's score stopped at the 12th level. Still far from it. Chu Fengmian looked at the result on the sword testing stone and muttered to himself. Chu Fengmian was only able to light up 1/10 of the 13th level before his sword intent was crushed. This also meant that Chu Fengmian was still far from the origin of the sword Dao. However, being able to light up the 13th level already proved that Chu Fengmian's sword Dao had already surpassed the peak. He had 1 foot in the door of the sword Dao's origin. In the future, Chu Fengmian might have a chance to truly comprehend the sword Dao's origin. Seeing Chu Fengmian's result, everyone's face was different. The most gloomy one was Gu Qianjun. Gu Qianjun's result was the 4th level of the sword testing stone, which was the same as Kuan Su's Heaven Piercer, ranking 5th. If Chu Fengmian's result was lower than his, he would have a chance to pass the assessment. However, as the result came out, the one who was affected the most was him. He was already eliminated from the assessment. He was unwilling to be eliminated like this. His eyes were filled with killing intent as he looked at Chu Fengmian. Something flew out from the sword testing stone. At this moment, someone suddenly exclaimed. Everyone quickly looked over and saw a crack suddenly opened on the sword testing stone. A ray of light flew out from it. This beam of light was about the height of a human. It was a wooden totem with all sorts of runes engraved on it. These runes were incomparably ancient, and no one could recognize them. However, the light flowing within them resembled streams of sword technique. Only a sword cultivator with a high cultivation base would be able to see through the mysteries of this pattern. Sword Dao Totem! All the sword cultivators exclaimed when they saw the totem that was as tall as a person. Everyone was an expert in sword Dao. How could they not recognize this object? It was the treasure of sword Dao, the sword Dao Totem. It was said that all the sword techniques in the world originated from the sword Dao Totem. Obtaining a sword Dao Totem was enough to establish a sect and become a sword master of a generation. The sword testing stone suddenly opened and a sword Dao Totem flew out from it. Is this the reward that Jian and I mentioned? A sword Dao Totem? Suddenly, someone recalled Jian Ni's words to Chu Fengmian. As long as one could reach the 10th level of the sword testing stone, he would be rewarded. Seeing the sword Dao Totem that flew out from the sword testing stone, everyone recalled a sentence. The faces of Flying Sword Emperor, Xian Songtian, Gu Qianjun and the others turned even uglier when they saw this scene. Chu Fengmian was actually rewarded with a sword Dao Totem. This meant that the Shang sword sect valued Chu Fengmian highly. Even though Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian had passed the assessment and could enter the next round, they did not receive the same treatment as Chu Fengmian. Just as everyone had expected, the sword principal totem flew towards Chu Fengmian the moment it flew out of the sword testing stone and stopped in front of him. Take it. This is the reward for the upper sword sect. Jian and I looked at Chu Fengmian and said slowly. Chu Fengmian nodded. When he saw the sword Dao Totem, his eyes were filled with shock. Although he knew that the upper sword sect's reward would not be an ordinary item, Chu Fengmian was both surprised and delighted that it was a sword Dao Totem. Outsiders and almost all sword cultivators only knew about the sword Dao Totem because of the countless sword techniques recorded in it. Only Chu Fengmian knew that there was a true treasure in the sword Dao Totem. It was the incomplete sword technique that led to the sword Dao origin. Chu Fengmian had only obtained a portion of this incomplete sword technique. His current understanding of the sword Dao had already entered the sword Dao origin realm. End of chapter. Chapter 2204. If Chu Fengmian could obtain all the sword principal totems and complete the incomplete swordsmanship, he might be able to comprehend the mystery of the sword principal origin. Chu Fengmian had been looking for the sword principal totem carefully, but he had only obtained a few pieces of information. Chu Fengmian did not expect to obtain a sword principal totem in the Shang sword sect relic. It was a complete surprise. Chu Fengmian looked at the sword principal totem and was about to take it into the empty ring. Suddenly, numerous figures appeared beside Chu Fengmian and surrounded him in an instant. Numerous sword lights burst out and slashed toward Chu Fengmian. These figures were none other than Gu Qianjun. Gu Qianjun suddenly took action when Chu Fengmian took the sword principal totem. Gu Qianjun also knew that he would die today, so he might as well kill Chu Fengmian directly and take the sword principal totem from Chu Fengmian's hand and then escape. Just now, when Chu Fengmian was undergoing the assessment, Gu Qianjun had been brewing the killing intent in his heart. He had already accumulated the strength, and all the accumulated strength burst out at this moment. Each of these figures looked no different from the real Gu Qianjun. The swords in their hands flashed as they slashed at Chu Fengmian. For a moment, the sky was full of sword lights, slashing toward Chu Fengmian from all directions. These swordsmanship were absolute killing moves, blocking Chu Fengmian's side and leaving him with no way to escape. Gu Qianjun did not intend to leave any way for Chu Fengmian. He wanted to kill Chu Fengmian directly. Everyone was shocked when they saw Gu Qianjun take action. They did not expect that Gu Qianjun would dare to take action in front of Jian and I and directly kill Chu Fengmian. However, at this time, no one took action to stop Gu Qianjun. Instead, they stood aside and showed a look of amusement. Now, Chu Fengmian could be said to be the biggest threat to everyone. With Chu Fengmian's talent in swordsmanship, the Shang sword sect inheritance was likely to fall into Chu Fengmian's hands. But today, if Chu Fengmian was killed by Gu Qianjun, they would have gotten rid of one of their biggest enemies. Therefore, even though they saw Gu Qianjun taking action, they didn't have any intention to stop him. Many of them even had killing intent brewing in their eyes. It seemed that they wanted to take advantage of Chu Fengmian's crisis to kill him. Sword light filled the sky and shrouded Chu Fengmian, leaving him with no way to escape. Even an immortal marquis in the profound heaven realm might not be able to escape from the sword light, let alone an immortal general. What's more, Chu Fengmian's attention was focused on the sword principal totem, so he didn't notice Gu Qianjun's attack. Gu Qianjun seized the moment when Chu Fengmian was distracted and launched a sudden attack to kill Chu Fengmian. Jiuyu has descended. Blood will dye the world red. Gu Qianjun roared again and again. He spat out a large amount of blood essence from his mouth as a blood sacrifice to the sword. A blood-red moon appeared behind him. It was the strongest secret technique of the Jiuyu Canyon. Jiuyu descended and blood dyed the blade red. It was as if the end of the world had arrived. This kid is finished. It's good that he's dead. We'll have a chance if he's dead. Many sword cultivators cheered in their hearts. Chu Fengmian's death was definitely a good thing for them. So what if Chu Fengmian's sword principle aptitude was strong? Aptitude in sword principle didn't represent a person's strength. Especially now, Chu Fengmian was only in the half-step celestial realm. In everyone's opinion, Chu Fengmian's weakest point was his current strength. No matter how strong his sword principle was, it was meaningless if his strength was not enough. Gu Qianjun was an immortal general expert after all. He didn't hesitate to use his blood essence and launched a secret technique to launch a sneak attack. It was very likely that he could kill Chu Fengmian directly. Many people felt that Chu Fengmian was definitely going to die this time. Rumble! Sword light tore through the space and slashed towards Chu Fengmian, wanting to destroy everything. Want to kill me? However, just as the countless destructive swords were about to envelop Chu Fengmian, who was at the center of the countless swords, suddenly moved. The sword in his hand flashed, and in an instant, a long rainbow of sword chi swept down. Boom! 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 The countless sword lights around Chu Fengmian were destroyed by the sword light. The power of the sword swept away everything. Gu Qianjuan's numerous incarnations were all penetrated by the sword light. His incarnations were all killed. These incarnations were simply vulnerable in front of Chu Fengmian. He blocked it? Seeing that Chu Fengmian was standing there unscathed, Gu Qianjuan's expression changed drastically. In an instant, he hurriedly retreated and turned into a beam of light, trying to escape. Gu Qianjun immediately wanted to escape after his attack failed. However, at this moment, a sword light suddenly slashed down from the sky. The sword light was not from Chu Fengmian, but from Jian Ni. Jian Ni's face revealed a bit of anger. Gu Qianjun dared to make a move during the Shang sword sect's examination. This was equivalent to provoking the entire Shang sword sect. Jian Ni was furious and instantly attacked. The sword light was the power of the array that enveloped the whole Shang sword sect. It turned into a sword light and slashed towards Jian Ni. Although Jian Ni was not a living person, his most terrifying point was that he could mobilize the power of countless arrays in the Shang sword sect. Even though these formations had existed for tens of millions of years, they were not something that a mere immortal general could resist. Chapter 2205. The Flying Sword Emperor, Xian Songtian and the others were horrified. Just a moment ago, they were all filled with killing intent and wanted to kill Chu Fengmian. However, before they could make a move, Jian Ni took the lead and killed Gu Qianjun in an instant. His attack was so fast that they didn't have time to react. They originally thought that even if Jian Ni intervened, Gu Qianjun would be able to stall for some time. They never expected Jian Ni to be so powerful. Although Gu Qianjun was in the immortal general realm, his true strength was comparable to an immortal marquis in the profound heaven realm. Even an immortal king or an immortal marquis couldn't kill Gu Qianjun in one move. Immortal sage. A terrifying thought appeared in everyone's mind. Jian Ni's strength was at least comparable to a celestial sage. Jian Ni didn't use his own strength to attack, but the strength to control the countless arrays and restrictions in the upper sword sect ruins. However, Jian Ni was able to control the array formations and restrictions in the upper sword sect ruins. This also meant that Jian Ni was a genuine celestial saint expert in the upper sword sect ruins. Only a immortal sage could kill Gu Qianjun so easily without giving him any chance to fight back. Not only would they be able to kill Gu Qianjun, but they would also end up like Gu Qianjun if they made a move against a celestial saint expert. Death was the only way out for them. The two of them were waiting for an opportunity to attack, which saved their lives. Otherwise, Gu Qianjun wouldn't be the only one who died. How dare a puny immortal general challenge the dignity of the upper sword sect? You're courting death. Jian Ni's eyes were cold as he said, "Whoever dares to attack will die." Everyone felt a chill in their hearts when they saw Jian Ni's cold eyes. After witnessing Jian Ni's strength, they had completely dispelled the idea of attacking Chu Fengmian. Not to mention the fact that Jian Ni, a terrifying celestial saint expert, was standing here. The fact that he blocked Gu Qianjun's sneak attack made them understand that Chu Fengmian wasn't as easy to deal with as he seemed. Unless they had the confidence to kill Chu Fengmian in one move, they would only die if they attacked Chu Fengmian. What should we do? Are we really going to sit and watch this kid get the inheritance? The Flying Sword Emperor could not help but send a voice transmission to Xian Songtian. Originally, there was no relationship between the two of them. However, the two of them had decided to stand together in order to deal with Chu Fengmian. It's not that simple. This person might have gained some benefits now, but the person who will truly obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect will have to wait until the next stage to decide. I have a way to deal with him in the next stage. Xian Songtian's eyes flickered as he spoke. Could it be that the rumors are true? Does the Tianjian sect really know some secrets of the Shangjian sect? Upon hearing Xian Songtian's words, the Flying Sword Emperor's eyes flashed as he said, "That's right. So in a while, you and I will work together and listen to me. We still have a way to deal with this person. If this person really obtains the inheritance or leaves the upper sword sect's ruins, then both of us will suffer." Xian Songtian said coldly. "All right." The Flying Sword Emperor agreed without hesitation. It was impossible for him to deal with Chu Fengmian on his own. He could only team up with Xian Sangtian. Although Chu Fengmian did not know the contents of the secret conversation between Xian Sangtian and the Flying Sword Emperor, he could tell that it was related to him. The Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Sangtian had a grudge against Chu Fengmian. They would definitely not sit back and watch Chu Fengmian obtain the upper sword sex inheritance. Chu Fengmian would have felt strange if they had been quiet all the time. Let's team up. Even if you guys team up, you won't be able to stop me. Chu Fengmian looked at the Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Sangtian. His eyes were filled with boundless confidence. His current strength was no longer the same as before. If he had encountered the Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Sangtian when he had just arrived at the upper sword sex ruins, he would find it extremely difficult to deal with them. However, after leaving the library, Chu Fengmian's strength had increased by leaps and bounds. Even if the Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Sangtian were to team up, Chu Fengmian would not be afraid of them. There are a total of 6 people left. The top 4, Chu Fengmian, Xian Sangtian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Flying Sword Emperor. The 4 of you have passed the test and enter the next round. Jian Ni's face was incomparably pale. Although he had just killed Gu Qianjun, there was no change in his expression. He glanced at the crowd and said calmly, "The remaining 2, according to the rules, I will now give you 2 choices. Die or be a sword slave of my upper sword sect." Upon hearing this, Brilliant Void Piercer and Sword Immortal Qin's face turned pale. In the end, it was their turn. The inheritance of the upper sword sect was extremely cruel. Once they failed, there were only 2 paths. "I'm willing to die." Sword Immortal Qin looked at Jian and I and said. He was also an expert of the sword Dao. He was unwilling to be a sword slave and would rather die. "All right." Jian and I nodded his head and waved his hand. A sword light slashed down, and the body of enlightened Sword Qin was annihilated by this sword light, leaving not a single trace of him behind. Sword Immortal Qin had fallen. "What about you?" Jian Ni's gaze fell upon Brilliant Void Piercer. "I'm willing to be a slave." Brilliant Void Piercer's face changed slightly. Every word of his was incomparably heavy. However, compared to death, Brilliant Void Piercer wanted to live more. His aptitude was considered inferior among the countless immortal generals. He had painstakingly cultivated the Heaven Piercer Dao and had assassinated countless experts. He had gone through countless life and death battles to attain his current strength. He did not want to die. "All right." Jian Ni's face was expressionless. However, there was an additional seal in his hand and it flew into Brilliant Void Piercer's body. As the restriction entered the Kungsu Heaven Piercer's body, the Kungsu Heaven Piercer's body trembled. His face was extremely pale. He knew that once a restriction was placed on him, his life and death would no longer be in his control. "Go down." After doing all this, Jian and I waved his hand and a spatial tunnel appeared in front of Brilliant Void Piercer. No one knew where this spatial tunnel led to. Yes. However, Brilliant Void Piercer was already a sword slave and had no right to resist. He could only listen to Jian Ni's order and stepped into the spatial tunnel, disappearing from the square. Now, other than Jian and I, only Chu Fengmian, Xian Sangtian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, and Flying Sword Emperor were left. Sword Immortal Qin and Brilliant Void Piercer, one dead and one a slave. This outcome made everyone sigh incomparably. However, everyone knew that this was the cruelty of the upper sword sex inheritance. If they failed, they would also suffer the same fate. End of chapter. Chapter 2206. After all, only one person could obtain the inheritance of the Shang sword sect. As for the rest, they were all losers. However, at this point, there was no chance to retreat. Only Chu Fengmian and the other 3 were left to compete for the inheritance of the Shang sword sect. "All of you, follow me." Jian and I glanced at the crowd and flew off into the distance with a flash. Chu Fengmian and the other three followed closely behind Jian and I all the way, leaping over the square and over the mountain range. The surrounding scenery was constantly changing, and finally, they arrived in front of a huge teleportation array. Jian and I was the first to step into it. Then, Chu Fengmian and the other three followed closely behind and stepped into the teleportation array. Suddenly, the scene in front of them spun. After a long time, Chu Fengmian woke up and looked around. This place was a planet, a huge planet. On this planet, there were tall trees that were at least 1,000 meters tall. There was an ancient aura everywhere. It made people think of the Desolation Era and the scene of the Desolation Era before it was shattered. Not only the scene, but the planet was also filled with chaotic chi, and the spatial laws were extremely ancient. It looked like a part of the Desolation Era. This is the Jade Desolation Star, one of the sacred grounds of the Shang Sword Sect. In Chu Fengmian's mind, Xing Xian's voice slowly sounded. The Jade Desolation Star is a fragment of the ancient Baron's continent when it was shattered. This fragment was later obtained by an invincible expert of the Shang Sword Sect. With the power of the entire sect, this fragment was refined and finally turned into a planet. The Jade Desolation Star has always been the sacred ground of the Shang Sword Sect. Only the core disciples of the Shang Sword Sect are qualified to enter. Since you were sent here, it seems that the next assessment will determine who will obtain the inheritance. The Jade Desolation Star, one of the sacred grounds of the Shang Sword Sect. Listening to Xing Xian's words, Chu Fengmian couldn't help but look at the Jade Desolation Star. The entire Jade Desolation Star was shrouded in layers of seals. These layers of seals and arrays shrouded the sky of the Jade Desolation Star. Warriors and demon gods who had entered the Jade Desolate Star had almost no chance of escaping. Chu Fengmian's spiritual consciousness scanned the surroundings. The laws of the Jade Wilderness Star were extremely ancient. Chu Fengmian's spiritual consciousness was somewhat suppressed and could only explore the area within 100 miles. However, Chu Fengmian keenly sensed the aura of a living being in this area. In addition to Chu Fengmian and the other three, there were actually other living beings on the Jade Desolate Star, and it seemed that there were quite a lot of them. There's something strange about this place. What Chu Fengmian saw now was only the tip of the iceberg of the Jade Desolate Star, but it gave Chu Fengmian a strange feeling. Not only Chu Fengmian, but Xian Songtian, Flying Sword Emperor, and Divine Wood Sword Emperor also looked around cautiously after they woke up. They were all observing this strange planet. This place is called the Jade Wilderness Star. It is one of the holy lands of my Upper Sword Sect, and also the place where you will take your last test. While everyone was still observing the Jade Wilderness Star, Jian and I suddenly appeared, looked at everyone, and said coldly, "This test is to determine who will eventually obtain the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance." Everyone listened to Jian and I quietly, fearing that they would forget any of the contents. Everyone's expression was extremely serious. This test was to determine the ownership of the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. Everyone had gone through countless difficulties and dangers to finally reach this step, all for the sake of obtaining the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. Now the inheritance was placed in front of everyone. Now my Upper Sword Sect's strongest sword technique, the unparalleled sword technique, is on this planet. Whoever can obtain this unparalleled sword technique will be qualified to obtain the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. Jian and I glanced at the crowd and said coldly, "As for the remaining people, all those who failed will fall." Although everyone had guessed this point, they still felt a chill in their hearts when they heard Jian Ni's words. Among the 4 people present, only one could obtain the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. As for the remaining 3, they would definitely fall. Moreover, this test was even more cruel than the previous ones. They did not even have the right to choose. There was only one path, which was the path of death. Unparalleled sword technique. The unparalleled sword technique is actually on this planet? Chu Fengmian's mind raced after he heard Jian Ni's words. He had not expected the last test to be like this. Whoever could obtain the unparalleled sword technique would be able to obtain the upper sword sex inheritance. However, in Jian Ni's words, other than mentioning that the unparalleled sword technique was on this planet, there was no other information. Although this planet was not the largest, it was equivalent to the size of one of the 9 domains. Searching for a sword technique on this planet was no different from searching for a needle in a haystack. Sir Jian and I wonder if there is any sign of the unparalleled sword technique? Xian Songtian asked respectfully. Yes, when there is a 7-colored light on this planet, it means that the unparalleled sword technique is nearby. Jian and I said slowly. Go and fight for it. Whoever can obtain the unparalleled sword technique will be qualified to obtain the upper sword sex inheritance. After Jian and I finished his sentence, his figure disappeared completely. Let's go. In an instant, the 4 of them turned into streaks of light and flew in different directions. Whoever could obtain the unparalleled sword technique would be able to obtain the upper sword sex inheritance. It was a race against time. No one wanted to be slower than the others. Although there were 4 figures, there were actually 3 rays of light. Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had indeed teamed up as Lin Fan had guessed. The 4 rays of light separated for the time being. Unparalleled sword technique. Where is the unparalleled sword technique hidden? Where did the 7-colored light appear? Could it be that the unparalleled sword technique has also become a sword spirit? Chu Fengmian muttered to himself as he flew, searching for the traces of the unparalleled sword technique. Previously, when Chu Fengmian was in the book collection pavilion, he had seen a large number of sword techniques that had already given birth to a sword spirit. If the unparalleled sword technique had also given birth to a sword spirit, it would be extremely troublesome. The more mysterious the sword technique, the more powerful the sword spirit that was born from it. The unparalleled sword technique was one of the top 10 ancient supreme immortal technique. Its power was not inferior to the number 1 sword technique. If a sword spirit was born, the strength of the unparalleled sword technique's sword spirit would be extremely terrifying. It would be far beyond the immortal general, immortal marquis, or even an immortal king or immortal duke. End of chapter. Chapter 2207. If this peerless sword art were to give birth to a sword spirit, even if Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, Flying Sword Emperor and Divine Wood Sword Emperor joined forces, they might not be a match for the sword spirit of this peerless sword art. Chu Fengmian had also experienced the power of the 10 supreme ancient sword arts from the first sword art. It was definitely far beyond ordinary sword arts, and even immortal emperor sword arts. In the past, countless sword emperors had created hundreds of sword arts. However, only a few of them were qualified to be listed in the 10 supreme ancient immortal arts. Chu Fengmian did not dare to underestimate the existence of this peerless sword art. Impossible. The peerless sword art needs millions of years to give birth to a sword spirit. It's still far from that. Hearing Chu Fengmian's words, Xian suddenly sneered in his mind. You should know that the stronger the existence, the more it's not allowed by the world. It's impossible for the peerless sword art to give birth to a sword spirit without millions of years. You don't have to worry. The stronger the existence, the more it's not allowed by the world. When Chu Fengmian heard this, he muttered to himself. Yes, Chu Fengmian also deeply understood this point. Every time he broke through, it was thousands of times more difficult than ordinary martial artists and demon gods. Therefore, with his current strength, he did not dare to rashly attempt the celestial tribulation. If this peerless sword art could give birth to a sword spirit, it would definitely be one of the most heaven-defying existences in the world. It might even become an immortal emperor in the future. It was precisely because of this peerless sword art that his chances of giving birth to a sword spirit were so slim. Hiss! While Chu Fengmian was deep in thought, a huge figure suddenly appeared in front of him. It was a giant bird, 1,000 feet tall. It flew to Chu Fengmian's side and spread its wings, covering the sky and splitting the sun. Suddenly, it opened its mouth and tried to devour Chu Fengmian. The giant bird's face showed a bit of anger. It opened its mouth and tried to devour Chu Fengmian. Furious owl? Chu Fengmian's figure flashed and immediately dodged the giant bird's attack. At the same time, his gaze fell on the giant bird. He sized it up and recognized its identity. Chu Fengmian had never seen the giant bird in front of him before. However, in some ancient books, Chu Fengmian had heard some records of the giant bird. The giant bird was called Nu Shao and it was an ancient, desolate beast. In the Antiquity Age, even an ordinary Nu Shao had the strength of a celestial being. The king of the Nu Shao clan was no weaker than the experts of Xian Songtian. Even though Nu Shao wasn't the king of the Nu Shao tribe, he was still a powerful Nu Shao. His speed was much faster than most immortal generals. If Chu Fengmian had reacted a little slower, he would have been buried in this furious owl's mouth. This wild beast that has been extinct for millions of years actually exists on the Jade Desolate Star? Chu Fengmian was a little shocked, but the sword in his hand didn't stop. It suddenly came out of the scabbard and turned into a sword, slashing towards Nu Shao. Hua! The sword came out of the scabbard and slashed at Nu Zhao's wings. However, Chu Fengmian's sword was blocked by the wings. There was only a sword mark left on the wings. The sword didn't manage to slash through Nu Zhao's wings. It is indeed a true desolate beast. Such a body is really strong. Chu Fengmian sighed in his heart when he saw the wound caused by the sword. Desolate beasts could be said to be the true overlords of the Antiquity Age. The word desolate in the Antiquity Age referred to desolate beasts. Compared to the demonic beast clan, desolate beasts didn't have consciousness. Usually, only the king of the desolate beast clan had consciousness and could converse with humans. Most of the desolate beasts only knew how to fight based on their instincts. For the demonic beast clan, as long as they stepped into the divine power realm, they would gain intelligence and could transform into human form. Their intelligence wouldn't be lower than human warriors. However, for many desolate beasts, no matter how strong they were, they couldn't transform into human form. It was extremely rare for them to have consciousness and be able to converse with humans. It was because of this that although the desolate beast clan didn't have consciousness, they had extremely strong battle instincts and incomparably strong bodies. It was almost impossible for them to defeat a desolate beast of the same realm. Chu Fengmian's previous sword strike could kill most immortal generals. However, it only left a shallow sword mark on Nu Zhao's wings. The feathers of Nu Shao were much harder than ordinary immortal artifacts. After fighting with a desolate beast, Chu Fengmian understood that the records of desolate beasts in the ancient books weren't exaggerated at all. Hiss! Nu Shao was in pain and the anger on its face grew. It flapped its wings and its huge body charged towards Chu Fengmian. To the desolate beast clan, their bodies were the best weapons. Nu Zhao's sudden charge could shatter 1,000 zhang tall mountain. However, Chu Fengmian was already prepared. The sword in his hand changed. Suddenly, the moment the sword fell, thousands of sword shadows fell. The 10,000 sword shadows slashed at the same spot on Furious Owl's wings, which was equivalent to Furious Owl withstanding 10,000 sword shadows in an instant. No matter how tough his body was, he wouldn't be able to withstand 10,000 sword shadows. Whoosh! Nu Zhao's body exploded in the air. Devour! Chu Fengmian's mind moved. He immediately activated the sky-devouring secret technique and devoured all of Nu Zhao's essence and blood. The essence and blood of this desolate beast contains a huge amount of power. It's just right for me to increase my strength. The essence blood contained in the raging owl was almost on par with the essence blood of the heavenly saint Sword Emperor. After being devoured by the heaven-devouring secret technique, it immediately surged into Chu Fengmian's body and turned into his power. Now that Chu Fengmian's sword principle had improved, his strength was now qualified to break through the celestial tribulation. What he lacked was spiritual power. Devouring Nu Zhao's essence and blood was increasing Chu Fengmian's spiritual power. At the same time, not only Nu Zhao's essence and blood, but his feathers were also put into the empty ring by Chu Fengmian. The feathers of Nu Zhao were harder than ordinary immortal weapons. If these feathers were refined into an immortal weapon, it would definitely be a powerful immortal armor. Hiss, hiss. The moment Chu Fengmian killed the Nu Zhao, suddenly more huge figures flew over from the distance. It was actually several more Nu Zhao. These Nu Zhao seemed to have been attracted by the fluctuations of the battle just now. When they saw Chu Fengmian, they immediately showed a fierce look, opened their mouths and rushed towards Chu Fengmian. End of chapter. Chapter 2208. Good timing. Chu Fengmian's expression did not change at the sight of so many furious owls. These furious owls contained an enormous amount of blood essence. This blood essence could be turned into spiritual power to increase Chu Fengmian's strength. It was extremely rare to find one or two of these wild beasts in the current era. Unexpectedly, there were groups of furious owls on the Jade Desolate Star. Furious owls were wild beasts that lived in groups. According to ancient records, in the Desolation era, some groups of furious owls had tens of millions of them. When they attacked together, they hunted warriors and demon gods. Even some ultimate heaven realm experts would be in danger if they encountered a group of furious owls. However, the number of furious owls in front of him was far less than that. There were only 7 or 8 of them. Even if they joined forces, Chu Fengmian was not afraid at all. Chu Fengmian brandished his 2 swords and displayed his swordsmanship. For a moment, the sky was filled with flickering sword shadows. Every time a sword shadow fell, it meant that a furious owl had been killed. On the spot, 4 of the furious owls were killed by Chu Fengmian. The blood essence of these furious owls was directly absorbed by Chu Fengmian and poured into Chu Fengmian's body. The feathers on their bodies were all stored in Chu Fengmian's empty ring. After devouring so much blood essence, Chu Fengmian felt that his strength was increasing by about 5%. The blood essence of these furious owls had all been turned into spiritual power and poured into Chu Fengmian's blood vessels. The blood essence of each furious owl that was killed by Chu Fengmian became a part of Chu Fengmian's strength. Hiss! Chu Fengmian killed more than half of the furious owls in the blink of an eye. The rest of the furious owls also knew that Chu Fengmian was in danger. Their eyes showed some fear as they turned around and flapped their wings, fleeing in all directions. Although these furious owls did not have consciousness, they still had instincts. When they encountered danger, they wanted to escape immediately. Want to escape? Chu Fengmian sneered. His figure flickered again and again as he chased after the fleeing furious owls. In Chu Fengmian's view, these furious owls were all great nourishment. Their blood essence could be turned into Chu Fengmian's strength. Of course, Chu Fengmian would not let them go. After killing a huge number of void beasts and devouring a lot of mystical void crystals in the depths of the void, Qin Nan and the rest of the mystical void crystals. Right now, Chu Fengmian's control over the Tao of space had far surpassed the immortal generals and even the immortal Marquis realm. The speed of his escape light was comparable to the 5th level of the immortal King realm. Although these furious owls were desolate beasts with immense strength and their flying speed was extremely fast, they were incomparable to Chu Fengmian's escape light. In just a few breaths, Chu Fengmian had caught up to the fleeing furious owls. The sword in his hand flashed repeatedly as he slew the furious owls. Their blood essences were completely devoured by Chu Fengmian. Swallow! The heaven-devouring secret skill was activated. Immediately, the impurities within the furious owl's essence blood were all removed. The remaining essence blood was no longer scarlet in color. Instead, it was green-blue in color. After being refined by the heaven-devouring secret skill, the furious owl's essence blood no longer contained the slightest power of a desolate beast. What was left was pure spiritual power, which was directly devoured by Chu Fengmian in one breath. Good, my strength has increased by about 10%. If I can hunt more desolate beasts, I will have the confidence to break through the celestial tribulation on the jade desolate star. Chu Fengmian could not help but say as he felt the increase in his strength. There were many desolate beasts on the jade desolate star, much more than what Chu Fengmian had sensed before. While chasing these furious owls, Chu Fengmian felt countless ancient auras. A large number of desolate beasts were hiding in the forest of giant trees below. Among these desolate beasts, many of them emitted auras that made Chu Fengmian extremely fearful. Even if Chu Fengmian took action, he might not be able to do anything to those desolate beasts. The strongest of the desolate beast clan was even comparable to the heaven realm, celestial sage, and even immortal venerables. Although there might not be such desolate beasts on the jade desolate star, even some of the profound heaven realm level desolate beasts would be extremely troublesome for Chu Fengmian if he encountered them. And now, Chu Fengmian did not intend to waste time on hunting these desolate beasts. His top priority was to find the unparalleled sword technique and obtain the inheritance of the highest sword sect. Finding the unparalleled sword technique on the jade desolate star is like looking for a needle in a haystack, Chu Fengmian said with a frown. While chasing after the furious owl, Chu Fengmian also opened his spiritual consciousness to search for the unparalleled sword technique, but to no avail. Given the size of the jade desolate star, it would be impossible for Chu Fengmian to thoroughly search the entire jade desolate star without a few months. And in these few months, who knew if the unparalleled sword technique would be obtained by the divine wood sword emperor Xian Songtian, or the flying sword emperor. Unparalleled sword technique. Since this unparalleled sword technique is the most powerful sword technique in the upper sword sect, it is impossible for it not to reveal a little bit of its aura, unless the aura of this unparalleled sword technique was deliberately concealed. Chu Fengmian's mind was spinning rapidly. Generally, some natural treasures would emit aura if they fell into a planet. Such an unparalleled sword technique was on the jade desolate star. Logically speaking, it was impossible for it to be so quiet, unless the aura of this unparalleled sword technique was deliberately concealed. Upper sword sect, yes, this unparalleled sword chi is from the upper sword sect. I wonder if this unparalleled sword chi can find the unparalleled sword technique. Chu Fengmian suddenly thought. There was a key thing on his body, which was the unparalleled sword chi. This unparalleled sword chi was once the most precious treasure of the upper sword sect. With the unparalleled sword chi, it was possible to find the unparalleled sword technique. Go! Chu Fengmian's mind moved, and immediately the 2,815 unparalleled sword chi scattered and flew out, searching for the existence of the unparalleled sword technique. On the jade desolate star, apart from Chu Fengmian and the other three, there were only endless wild beasts left. Although Chu Fengmian did not know the aura of the unparalleled sword technique, as long as he went to explore the area that contained sword intent, it would most likely be the hiding place of the unparalleled sword technique. The unparalleled sword technique, which was ranked among the top 10 ancient celestial immortal techniques, had a sharp sword intent that could not be completely concealed. Moreover, the unparalleled sword chi, as a sword principal treasure, was extremely sensitive to sword intent. In the blink of an eye, the surrounding area was completely explored. End of chapter. Chapter 2209. Not a single trace of sword intent could be found within a radius of 1,000 miles. Continue. Chu Fengmian was not in a hurry. He continued to urge the supreme sword qi to search in all directions. The 2,815 strands of supreme sword qi spread out to search, but it was much faster than Chu Fengmian searching alone. Moreover, Chu Fengmian did not expect to find traces of the unparalleled sword technique very quickly. Since Jian and I had used the Jade Desolate Star as the final assessment place, it was naturally impossible for others to find the unparalleled sword technique so easily. Moreover, there were dangers everywhere on the Jade Desolate Star. A large number of desolate beasts inhabited the place. The supreme sword qi that Chu Fengmian had dispersed had been targeted by some desolate beasts and had almost been captured by them. Fortunately, these supreme sword qi had all recognized him as their master. Chu Fengmian's control of these supreme sword qi was also extremely high. When he encountered danger, he could directly withdraw the supreme sword qi. However, in just a few hours, Chu Fengmian discovered more than a dozen wild beasts whose strength had stepped into the mysterious heaven realm. There was even an ancient rock divine lizard whose strength had reached the immortal king realm. Whether it was Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, or the divine wood sword emperor who encountered this ancient rock divine lizard, it boded ill rather than well. Why are there so many wild beasts living on the Jade Desolate Star? Many wild beasts have even given birth to tribes. The more Chu Fengmian looked at the Jade Desolate Star, the more surprised he was. He had never thought that he could see such a planet in this era. This is not strange. When the Desolation era was broken, the invincible expert of the Upper Sword sect not only collected such a fragment and turned it into the Jade Desolate Star, but also captured many wild beasts in the Desolation era and raised them on the Jade Desolate Star. Xian explained. This Jade Desolate Star has always been a holy land for the disciples of the Upper Sword sect to train and cultivate. They fight and kill the desolate beasts. However, after tens of millions of years, the Jade Desolate Star has been sealed off. The desolate beasts inside have multiplied, and it is not surprising that some powerful desolate beasts are born. Unfortunately, these wild beasts cannot be used by me. Otherwise, if all the wild beasts on the Jade Desolate Star were born, it would be enough to sweep the entire 9 regions. Chu Fengmian said to himself. Subduing a desolate beast? This is something that is nearly impossible. Even in the primordial era, there were few mighty figures that could tame a desolate beast. The desolate beast's bloodline is destined to be impossible to tame. Xing Xian shook his head. However, that might not be the case for you. You have inherited the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast and are in control of the heaven-devouring source energy. It might not be impossible for you to subdue a desolate beast. The heaven-devouring beast is the ancestor of the desolate beasts. All the desolate beasts in the world have inherited the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast. Your bloodline is extremely effective against these desolate beasts. It's just that your current cultivation level is too low. The power of the heaven-devouring beast bloodline has yet to be fully revealed. If you step into the celestial realm and reveal your heaven-devouring beast bloodline, those raging owls won't dare to attack you. Chu Fengmian nodded. He also knew that Xing Xian was right. Although Chu Fengmian had encountered countless fortuitous encounters and had even become a mutated species of heaven and earth, obtaining the origin powers of the 3 great innate divine beasts, the dark whale, the heaven-devouring beast, and the ancestral sky dragon. Chu Fengmian's cultivation level was still too low. Chu Fengmian could mobilize less than 1% of the true power of the origin of the 3 innate divine beasts. As long as Chu Fengmian stepped into the celestial realm, he could really mobilize the origin of the 3 innate divine beasts. Chu Fengmian had already decided that after obtaining the unparalleled sword art and the inheritance of the Shang sword sect, he would immediately go into seclusion to break through the celestial tribulation. I've found the trace. At this moment, Chu Fengmian's face suddenly changed slightly. He suddenly felt the existence of a little sword essence in one of the supreme sword chi. In this jade wilderness star, the existence that contained sword essence was most likely the unparalleled sword art. In an instant, Chu Fengmian's figure flickered again and flew directly in the direction of the supreme sword chi. In a few minutes, Chu Fengmian flew to the place where the supreme sword chi was located. Just below Chu Fengmian was a huge valley. Although it was called a valley, it was still thousands of feet wide and could be considered extremely huge. However, on the jade desolate star, such a canyon was nothing. There are no wild beasts around here? Chu Fengmian observed the surroundings of the valley and frowned. The surroundings of the valley were extremely desolate. Even with Chu Fengmian's spiritual awareness, he did not find any wild beasts aura. Wild beasts lived everywhere on the jade desolate star. It was strange that there was no aura of any wild beast in the surroundings of such a canyon. Only if there was an even more powerful existence in the valley would the other desolate beasts not dare to approach it. With my current spiritual awareness, even a wild beast of the immortal king realm can't hide from my spiritual awareness. Could it be that the wild beast occupying this valley is stronger than the immortal king realm? Above the immortal king realm was the peak of the mysterious heaven realm, the immortal monarch realm. If there was really a wild beast of the immortal monarch realm in this valley, then if Chu Fengmian approached it easily, this wild beast could kill Chu Fengmian in one blow. Although Chu Fengmian's strength was comparable to an immortal marquis, he was still 2 realms away from the immortal monarch realm. Such a realm was not something that Chu Fengmian's various opportunities could contend with. However, when Chu Fengmian approached the valley, he could clearly feel a sword essence emanating from this valley. It was very likely that the unparalleled sword art was in this valley. Chu Fengmian was also hesitating whether to go in or not. Someone is coming? However, at this moment, Chu Fengmian suddenly felt 2 figures flying over. Chu Fengmian hurriedly hid his aura and hid in the space. He glanced over and saw that the 2 figures were Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor. The 2 of them had just arrived on the Jade Wilderness Star and had joined forces. No one knew what they were planning. Chu Fengmian did not expect to see the 2 of them so soon. The 2 of them were actually just a little slower than Chu Fengmian. They had also arrived near this valley and looked in the direction that the 2 of them had flown all the way here. The 2 of them did not search for it bit by bit like Chu Fengmian. Instead, they seemed to have known from the beginning that the unparalleled sword art was in this valley and had flown all the way here. Chapter 22:10. This made Chu Fengmian extremely surprised. He had used the supreme sword chi to search in different directions before he finally found this valley. But now, the Flying Sword Emperor was swaggering over from the mysterious firmament heaven. Could Xian Songtian have known about the location of the unparalleled sword technique? Chu Fengmian's eyes flickered. He knew that the unparalleled sword technique could only be from Xian Songtian and not the Flying Sword Emperor. The Tianjian sect had been destroyed for millions of years, and the news of the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect had only been spread from the Tianjian sect. It was said that the Tianjian sect had obtained a portion of the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. This allowed the Tianjian sect to rise from an unknown sect in the 9 regions to one of the 7 great sects of the 9 regions. This rumor was half true and half false. However, judging from Xian Songtian's performance, this rumor was probably true. Let's see what the 2 of them want to do first. Chu Fengmian hid in the void. He was not in a hurry to reveal himself. Chu Fengmian was originally considering whether to enter the valley to investigate, but he was also worried that there would be danger. Now that Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had arrived, Chu Fengmian could also see if the 2 of them would enter the valley. Chu Fengmian could also wait at the side for an opportunity. Brother Xian, is the unparalleled sword technique in the valley before us? Xian Tsangtian and the Flying Sword Emperor flew towards the valley. As they got closer to the valley, Chu Fengmian could clearly hear their conversation. The Flying Sword Emperor had followed Xian Tsangtian all the way and had already lowered his stance. He had already regarded Xian Tsangtian as his master. This was something that the Flying Sword Emperor could not do anything about. Among the four of them, the Flying Sword Emperor was the weakest and he had the least hope of obtaining the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. If he wanted to live, he could only rely on one of them. The Flying Sword Emperor had a grudge against Chu Fengmian, and it was impossible for him to rely on Chu Fengmian. On the other hand, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had always been a lone wolf, and was not suitable either. Regardless, the Flying Sword Emperor could only rely on Xian Tsangtian and stand together with him. Xian Tsangtian wanted to deal with Chu Fengmian. With the death of Gu Qianjun, he lacked manpower. It was a good thing for him to have the help of the Flying Sword Emperor. Naturally, the two of them hit it off and joined forces. However, Xian Tsangtian was clearly the leader of this alliance. That's right. I can feel that the unparalleled sword technique is in this valley. When Xian Tsangtian heard Flying Sword Emperor's words, he said coldly. Chu Fengmian would never have thought that even if he had the upper hand in the beginning, he would have wasted all his previous effort. The patriarchs of the Tianjian sect had already guessed the content of this test, so they gave me the unparalleled sword ring. As Xian Tsangtian spoke, he touched the ring on his right finger. The ring was simple and looked extremely ordinary. It was no different from an ordinary ancient ring. It was so inconspicuous that Chu Fengmian did not notice it before. However, when he heard the ring's name, Chu Fengmian's heart skipped a beat. He could not help but observe the empty ring on Xian Tsangtian's hand. Unparalleled sword ring. The reason why Xian Tsangtian could find this valley was related to the unparalleled sword ring in his hand. Moreover, the name was most likely related to the unparalleled sword technique. The unparalleled sword technique, the strongest sword technique of the Shang sword sect, was one of the 10 supreme ancient immortal techniques. It was created by the founder of the Shang sword sect, the strongest immortal emperor of the Shang sword sect, the unparalleled sword emperor. The unparalleled sword ring was also related to the unparalleled sword emperor. Although I can't fully activate the power of the unparalleled sword ring, it's still easy for me to sense the location of the unparalleled sword technique. The unparalleled sword technique is indeed in this valley. Xian Tsangtian said again. He was sizing up the valley in front of him. Then what are we waiting for? Let's go in directly. Once we obtain the unparalleled sword technique, Brother Xian will become the successor of the Shang sword sect and you can kill Chu Fengmian. As for me, I will have to rely on Brother Xian in the future. The Flying Sword Emperor said hurriedly. Don't worry. Once I obtain the inheritance of the Shang sword sect, I will not treat you unfairly. At that time, I will let you join our Tianjian sect. Our Tianjian sect is not only one of the 7 great sects of the 9 domains, we are also related to the 9 domains. We are a sacred region sect. Xian Tsangtian said proudly. Sacred region sect. Hearing these words, the Flying Sword Emperor's face was filled with excitement. In the eyes of all the martial artists and demon gods, the sacred region was a high and mighty existence. Anyone who could join a sacred region sect would have a bright future. For example, in the extraterritorial starry sky, an ordinary heavenly human realm martial artist was a high and mighty existence. An immortal general was the overlord of a star region. However, in the sacred region sect, a heavenly human realm martial artist was just an ordinary disciple. As for an immortal general, he was just a figure and was far from being an expert. The heritage of the sacred region sect, the records of the sword techniques and the cultivation techniques were not comparable to those that were circulated outside. The reason why the Flying Sword Emperor was willing to join Xian Songtian was because Xian Songtian was from the Tianjian sect. Let's go. Let's go in first and obtain the unparalleled sword technique. Then, we will go back and look for Jian and I, and let him kill Chu Fengmian. Let Chu Fengmian die on the Jade Desolate Star to prevent any more trouble. Xian Songtian observed the valley before he said. Then, he gradually descended and stepped into the valley. The Flying Sword Emperor followed closely behind him. Both of them entered the valley. They really went in. Looking at Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor's figure entered the valley, Chu Fengmian gradually revealed himself. Xian Songtian actually has the unparalleled sword ring. Such a treasure can directly find the unparalleled sword technique. I almost died in the hands of this person. Chu Fengmian looked at the back of Xian Songtian, and there was a lingering fear in his heart. If Chu Fengmian was still unaware, Xian Songtian would have already obtained the unparalleled sword technique and the inheritance of the Supreme Sword Sect. Chu Fengmian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were going to die on the Jade Desolate Star. After all, once Jian and I took action, an unparalleled celestial saint, Chu Fengmian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor would not be able to survive in his hands. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian's luck was good as he found the valley before Xian Songtian. Let's go. Chu Fengmian's figure moved quietly and hid in the void. He quietly followed behind Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. Chapter 22:11. Xian Songtian's strength was not to be underestimated. He was a peerless genius that had been carefully nurtured by the Tianjian sect. For Xian Songtian, the Tianjian sect had paid a huge price to obtain the upper sword execution order portrait. They had even made an exception and passed down the flying celestial sword art, the supreme technique of the Tianjian sect. Now, even the unparalleled sword ring had been given to Xian Songtian. It was obvious that the Tianjian sect valued Xian Songtian. The Tianjian sect's foundation was unfathomable. It was even related to the rumored Tianjiu domain. Chu Fengmian did not dare to underestimate Xian Songtian. Chu Fengmian hid his body and followed Xian Songtian 100 feet away. Although they were 1,000 feet apart, Chu Fengmian's five senses, every movement of Xian Songtian and their conversation couldn't escape his eyes. Chu Fengmian also followed Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor into the valley. Chu Fengmian was worried that there would be danger in the valley. Hence, he did not enter rashly. Now that Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had entered the valley, they could help Chu Fengmian explore the dangers in the valley. If there was no danger, Chu Fengmian could take action immediately and snatch the unparalleled sword technique. Given Chu Fengmian's current strength, it would not be a problem to snatch the unparalleled sword technique from the two of them. Xian Songtian, Flying Sword Emperor, even if the two of you join forces and plot for half a day, the unparalleled sword technique will still fall into Chu Fengmian's hands. Chu Fengmian's lips curled into a cold smile. However, he had already completely hidden his body in the surrounding space. There was no fluctuation that could be transmitted out. Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor were extremely cautious when they entered the valley. They walked step by step into the valley, not daring to rush in rashly. It was indeed strange that there were no traces of any desolate beasts in the valley. Xian Songtian could sense that the unparalleled sword technique was in the valley with the help of the unparalleled sword ring. However, he did not know what exactly was hidden in the valley. However, Chu Fengmian could sense that there was an invisible force that shrouded the sky above the valley. His spiritual consciousness was suppressed within it. If they were outside, they wouldn't be able to use their spiritual sense to explore the valley. He could only step into it and observe it with his own eyes. Chu Fengmian followed mysterious Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor all the way to the depths of the valley. The valleys on both sides of the valley became wider and wider until they reached the deepest part. A huge cave appeared before Chu Fengmian's eyes. The cave was thousands of feet long and wide, and could accommodate a huge creature. The unparalleled sword art is in this cave. As they approached the cave, everyone could clearly feel the sword intent that was emitted from the cave. The sword intent was so strong that it actually took the form of numerous spiritual swords when it appeared. Just the sword will that appeared was enough to take form. Only the unparalleled sword art, one of the 10 supreme immortal arts of the antiquity times, could possess such power. Without needing to enter the cave, Chu Fengmian could confirm that the unparalleled sword art was indeed in the cave. Not only Chu Fengmian, but Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor also noticed it immediately. They looked into the cave and saw that it was pitch black. Their faces were filled with fear. In the valley, spiritual consciousness could not be spread out at all. As such, no one knew what was hidden in the cave. After stepping into the immortal general realm, although their 5 senses were thousands of times better than ordinary people, it was still difficult to see what was hidden in the pitch-black cave. Since we are already here, there is no reason to leave. Moreover, if the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Chu Fengmian discover this cave, it will be troublesome. Let's go in directly. Xian Songtian's eyes flickered and there was a hint of madness in his eyes. Wealth came from danger. No matter what, he was the first to discover the cave. Naturally, he could not delay until Chu Fengmian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor arrived. Not only Chu Fengmian, but the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's strength was also unfathomable. Although Xian Songtian's sword principle had surpassed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor in the previous round, it did not represent his true strength. Xian Songtian did not want to delay any longer. If we join forces, we can retreat directly if we encounter any danger. The Flying Sword Emperor nodded. The two of them took out their spiritual swords and walked into the cave together. Looking at Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor walking into the cave, Chu Fengmian also stopped outside the cave and did not enter rashly. However, Chu Fengmian was fully focused on every movement in the cave. No sound could escape his ears. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, time passed by bit. Since Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had entered the cave, there had been no commotion. Although Chu Fengmian's face was as calm as possible, there was still some anxiety in his heart. If there was nothing in the cave and Xian Songtian obtained the unparalleled sword principle, everything would be over. At that time, the Supreme Sword Sect's inheritance would fall into Xian Songtian's hands. The first person that Xian Songtian wanted to kill would be Chu Fengmian. Boom! Just as Chu Fengmian was getting anxious and was about to enter the cave, a sudden roar resounded. Inside the cave, the earth quaked and the mountains shook. Immortal energy exploded within the cave. Waves of aftershocks erupted from the cave. Let's go! Swoosh! In an instant, 2 figures flew out of the cave. These 2 figures were Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor, who had just entered the cave. The 2 of them flew out of the cave in horror. At a glance, more than half of their bodies had disappeared without a trace. It was as if more than half of their bodies had been bitten off, and they looked extremely miserable. In order to escape from the cave, the 2 of them did not spare any energy to reconstruct their bodies. Obviously, the 2 of them had fallen into an extremely dangerous situation. That was why they had escaped in such a hurry. There's something in the cave. Chu Fengmian's figure retreated and hid in a corner of the valley. He saw that when Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor left the cave, a huge figure rushed out of the cave. This figure was 1,000 feet tall. It was completely white and looked like a wolf. However, there was a pair of wings on its back. It was a desolate beast that rushed out of the cave. Ancient desolate white wolf. Calm. Wonderful book house. Chapter 22:12. Chu Fengmian's heart skipped a beat when he saw the huge figure. There was an ancient desolation white wolf in the cave. Moreover, it was an immortal lord realm ancient desolation white wolf. Chu Fengmian had guessed that there might be an unparalleled desolate beast hiding in the valley. He did not expect Chu Fengmian to be able to guess it. The ancient desolation white wolf was one of the overlords of the desolate beast race during the desolate era. It was one of the most powerful desolate beast races. Once an ancient desolation white wolf reached adulthood, its strength would be at least at the immortal lord realm. Such a creature was unimaginable in the current era. The ancient desolation white wolf's strength would be comparable to an immortal lord realm ancient desolation white wolf. Some powerful ancient desolation white wolves could even reach the immortal lord realm, let alone the immortal lord realm. The most powerful wolf king could even reach the heavenly realm, could reach the immortal saint realm, or even the immortal reverent realm. The ancient desolation white wolf was a completely different existence from the desolate beasts that Chu Fengmian had encountered before. It was a desolate beast with an incomparably noble bloodline. It was extremely rare even during the desolate era. There was actually an ancient desolation white wolf hiding in the cave. Moreover, it was an immortal lord realm ancient desolation white wolf. It was no wonder that Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor were running away in a hurry. The ancient desolation white wolf could kill an immortal lord realm ancient desolation white wolf in a single blow. There was still some blood flowing from the corner of the ancient desolation white wolf's mouth. Apparently, half of the flesh of Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor had been bitten off by the ancient desolation white wolf in the cave. The fact that Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor could escape from the ancient desolation white wolf's mouth was already considered extremely cautious. Otherwise, they would have been eaten by the ancient desolation white wolf. Damn it! Ancient desolation white wolf. It's actually an ancient desolation white wolf. Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor cursed as they escaped from the cave. They quickly ran out of the valley. Escaping from the cave was far from safe for the two of them. The ancient desolation white wolf chased after them. The ancient desolation white wolf had a pair of wings on its back, and its flying speed was extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, he turned into a beam of white light and chased after Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. The ancient desolate white wolf left? Chu Fengmian watched as the ancient desolate white wolf chased after the Flying Sword Emperor. Chu Fengmian suddenly felt extremely excited. Since the primordial white wolf had left the cave, it meant that there was no longer any defense in the cave. Furthermore, the unparalleled sword technique was in the cave. This was an excellent opportunity for Chu Fengmian. Fortune comes from danger. Let's go all out. Chu Fengmian moved and flew into the cave without hesitation. He knew that the opportunity would only come in the blink of an eye. With the speed of the ancient desolation white wolf, once it caught up to Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Monarch, they would be killed instantly. Once the ancient desolation white wolf returned, Chu Fengmian would be in extreme danger. The ancient desolation white wolf was comparable to an invincible expert in the immortal realm. Even if Chu Fengmian had passed the Sky Man Great Tribulation, he might not be a match for the ancient desolation white wolf, let alone the current Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian might die in the hands of the ancient desolation white wolf. However, since Chu Fengmian had decided to go all out, he had to make the best use of his time. He could not afford to waste a single second. The cave was extremely dark, but Chu Fengmian could barely see the scene inside. Chu Fengmian went all the way to the deepest part of the cave and saw an ancient book placed on a stone platform. On the page of the ancient book there were two big words, unparalleled. Unparalleled sword technique. This is the unparalleled sword technique. The moment Chu Fengmian saw the unparalleled sword art, he immediately used the Battle Dragon Claw to grab the unparalleled sword art. How dare you steal the sword technique? Die. Just as Chu Fengmian displayed the unparalleled swordsmanship, an angry roar suddenly came from behind. Chu Fengmian hurriedly looked back and saw a huge figure rushing into the cave. It was the ancient Desolation White Wolf. Almost in a breath's time, the ancient Desolation White Wolf sensed Chu Fengmian's aura and returned to the cave. Its speed was beyond Chu Fengmian's imagination. Following the ancient Desolation White Wolf's roar, the surrounding space condensed and turned into sharp blades that slashed at Chu Fengmian. The ancient Desolation White Wolf was one of the few desolation beasts that majored in space. Its control of space had reached an incredible level. The space around Chu Fengmian was condensed and harder than steel. It was impossible to tear it apart. Chu Fengmian wanted to tear the space apart and escape, but he failed. Damn it! The ancient Desolation White Wolf is too fast. As long as Chu Fengmian had a second, he could enter the cave, take away the unparalleled sword art, and run away. However, the ancient Desolation White Wolf was too fast. The moment Chu Fengmian entered the cave, the ancient Desolation White Wolf rushed back. The sharp blades condensed by space tore the space apart at an extremely fast speed, leaving Chu Fengmian no time to react. Sky devouring! Immortal! In a split second, Chu Fengmian's immortal real body and 129,600 immortal crystals all operated. The immortal secret technique was fully activated, pushing Chu Fengmian's power to the extreme. All the power was injected into the 129,600 immortal crystals to protect Chu Fengmian's body. At the same time, the sky-devouring power burst out and turned into a huge black hole that shrouded Chu Fengmian's body, trying its best to resist the sharp blades that slashed at him. At the same time, the power of Ancestor Tianlong and the power of the mysterious whale burst out from Chu Fengmian's body and were injected into the two swords. The two swords slashed out at the same time. Chu Fengmian unleashed all of his power to resist the sharp blade that was slashing towards him. Rumble! The sharp blades condensed by space contained unimaginable power. Chu Fengmian's sky-devouring secret technique was shattered in an instant. Even though Chu Fengmian controlled the sky-devouring origin and used the sky-devouring secret technique, he could not devour such tyrannical power and was shattered in an instant. The next moment, the sharp blades collided with Chu Fengmian's two swords. Calm. Wonderful Book House. Chapter 22:13. Crack. Crack. When the spatial blades collided with Chu Fengmian's swords, Chu Fengmian's body was the first to shatter. Both of Chu Fengmian's arms were instantly shattered by the power that was transmitted over. In Chu Fengmian's body, the 129,600 immortal crystals formed an invincible defense. Now, the immortal crystals on the edges began to shatter one by one. The primordial Desolation White Wolf was an overlord among the Desolation Beast clan. Its strength was enough to surpass martial artists and demon immortals of the same realm. The power of these spatial blades surpassed any attack Chu Fengmian had ever seen before. If the two spiritual swords in Chu Fengmian's hands were ordinary immortal weapons, they would have broken in an instant. Ordinary immortal weapons couldn't withstand the collision of power. The ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword and the Titanic Godly Sword were once only heaven-grade spiritual weapons, but they had been with Chu Fengmian for a long time. For the first time, Chu Fengmian's strength, transformation, Chu Fengmian's sword intent and strength all poured into the two spiritual swords invisibly. The two spiritual swords had begun to transform into extreme immortal weapons, so they could withstand the bombardment of the spatial blades. The two spiritual swords could withstand it, but Chu Fengmian's body couldn't. His immortal crystals shattered one after another. Immortal! Reconstruct! Enduring the bombardment of the spatial blades, Chu Fengmian roared again and again, pushing his power to the extreme. Countless immortal stones poured into the sky-devouring secret technique at this moment, turning into incomparably pure immortal energy that poured into Chu Fengmian's body. The immortal crystals were reconstructed. Each time the 129,600 immortal crystals in Chu Fengmian's body was broken and reconstructed, the power they contained grew stronger. The primordial desolation White Wolf had put Chu Fengmian in an extremely dangerous situation, but it could be said that it had stimulated Chu Fengmian's potential. Only in a battle of life and death could a martial artist's true potential be stimulated. Any invincible expert must have defeated countless powerful enemies to have invincible strength. Only after experiencing numerous life and death battles could they transform. Now, as long as Chu Fengmian could escape from the hands of the ancient desolate White Wolf and successfully survive, this battle would be extremely beneficial to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian could also comprehend the power of the immortal monarch and improve his strength. Therefore, at this moment, Chu Fengmian went all out and unleashed all of his bloodline power. The ancestral sky dragon, the heaven-devouring beast, and the black whale, the bloodline power of the three innate divine beasts burst out from Chu Fengmian's body, turning into shadows. Boundless power poured into Chu Fengmian's body. The sword in his hand clashed repeatedly with the spatial blade. Eventually, the spatial blade's power was exhausted and it dissipated. However, even after blocking the spatial blade, Chu Fengmian didn't look relaxed at all. Instead, he looked extremely nervous. This move was just a casual attack for the ancient desolate White Wolf. For the wild beasts, their physical bodies were their most powerful means of attack. The spatial blade condensed from the spatial Tao was only 10% or 20% of the ancient desolate White Wolf's power. The ancient desolate White Wolf returned to the cave in an instant and blocked the entrance. He stared at Chu Fengmian with blood-red eyes. However, when the ancient desolate White Wolf saw the three figures behind Chu Fengmian, he was suddenly stunned. Although it was only for a moment, Chu Fengmian was sharp enough to capture it. Tianlong transformation. In an instant, the power of ancestor Tianlong erupted from Chu Fengmian's body, forcibly tearing the surrounding space apart and entering it in an instant. By the time the ancient desolate White Wolf reacted, Chu Fengmian's figure had already disappeared from the cave. At this time, Chu Fengmian no longer wanted to obtain the unparalleled sword technique. Although the unparalleled sword technique was good, it wasn't as important as his life. Chu Fengmian immediately exerted all his strength to activate the escape light and disappeared from the cave. Outside the valley, Chu Fengmian sat on the ground and gasped for breath. The fight with the ancient desolate White Wolf this time was extremely dangerous. Chu Fengmian almost died in the ancient desolate White Wolf's hands. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian had condensed the immortal real body, so his physical strength was much stronger than that of immortal generals and immortal marquises. Moreover, the immortal crystals could continuously reconstruct his body. Otherwise, Chu Fengmian would have been killed by the spatial blades just now. Moreover, he was able to escape now. Moreover, Chu Fengmian was able to escape this time because the ancient desolate White Wolf was stunned for a moment, which gave him the opportunity to escape. The ancient desolate White Wolf was stunned all of a sudden, as if it was intimidated by a force. Chu Fengmian was still thinking about the scene when he escaped. If it wasn't for the ancient desolate White Wolf being stunned, Chu Fengmian wouldn't have been able to escape. Chu Fengmian didn't have the opportunity to escape from the ancient desolate White Wolf. Chu Fengmian was extremely lucky to be able to escape unscathed this time. Although many of his immortal crystals were shattered, Chu Fengmian still had a large number of immortal stones on him. Chu Fengmian always carried these immortal stones with him, waiting for such a dangerous moment to use the immortal power within them to reconstruct his immortal crystals. Compared to Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Sangtian, who had half of his body devoured, Chu Fengmian was already extremely lucky this time. At least he could escape unscathed. However, if the ancient desolate White Wolf hadn't suddenly stopped, Chu Fengmian wouldn't have been able to escape unscathed. Chu Fengmian looked at the ancient desolate White Wolf's expression. He could tell that the ancient desolate white wolf had sensed something on Chu Fengmian's body that it was extremely afraid of. That was why it was suddenly stunned. Could it be the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast? Chu Fengmian calmed down and almost immediately guessed the reason why the ancient desolate white wolf was so wary. The bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast wasn't simply the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast in Chu Fengmian's body. Chu Fengmian's bloodline was also integrated into the heart of the heaven-devouring beast. The origin source of the heaven-devouring beast was flowing in Chu Fengmian's bloodline. The current Chu Fengmian could be considered as a half-heaven-devouring beast. It wasn't as simple as the bloodline. End of chapter. Chapter 22:14. Although the ancient desolate white wolf was the overlord of the desolate beast race, it was still a desolate beast. The heaven-devouring beast was the ancestor of the desolate beast. All the desolate beasts in the world had the bloodline of the heaven-devouring beast. The ancient desolate white wolf was no exception. The noble suppression of the bloodline caused the ancient desolate white wolf to be extremely fearful. In the end, Chu Fengmian seized the opportunity to escape. With the heaven-devouring beast bloodline in Chu Fengmian's body, it was enough to suppress many desolate beasts. It was even possible for those desolate beasts to submit to Chu Fengmian. However, the heaven-devouring beast bloodline did not affect the ancient desolate white wolf that much. The ancient desolate white wolf was one of the strongest existences in the desolate beast race. The suppression of the bloodline was also much smaller. Moreover, the strength of the ancient desolate white wolf had surpassed an ordinary ancient desolate white wolf. It had reached the immortal Lord realm, and its strength was far beyond the ancient desolate white wolf. Therefore, the ancient desolate white wolf could only suppress Chu Fengmian for a moment when it felt the power of the heaven-devouring beast bloodline. As for the next moment, if Chu Fengmian did not escape, he would have been buried in the wolf's stomach. If Chu Fengmian wanted to use the heaven-devouring beast bloodline to subdue or suppress the ancient desolate white wolf, it was simply impossible. The unparalleled sword principle is actually guarded by an ancient desolate white wolf. The sword sex assessment is actually so crazy? It should be impossible to pass. Chu Fengmian could only be described as crazy towards the sword sex assessment. An immortal lord ancient desolate white wolf was guarding the unparalleled sword principle. To defeat the ancient desolate white wolf, even if Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Flying Sword Emperor and dozens of helpers worked together, they would not be able to defeat the ancient desolate white wolf, let alone Chu Fengmian. To the ancient desolate white wolf, Chu Fengmian's strength was only considered as an ant. At most, he would be an annoying ant. There was still a chance for him to escape from the ancient desolate white wolf. However, it was impossible for Chu Fengmian and the others to fight the ancient desolate white wolf head-on. Even 100 Chu Fengmians would not be able to fight the ancient desolate white wolf. This test was almost impossible. It was easy to find the unparalleled sword technique, but it was almost impossible to take it away from the hands of the ancient desolate white wolf. Even Chu Fengmian was somewhat helpless. Xingxuan, do you have any ideas? Helpless, Chu Fengmian could only ask Xing Xian. Xing Xian's understanding of the sword sect far surpassed Chu Fengmian's. Perhaps he had some ideas. There's no other way. Unless you use my real body, you won't be able to fight against the ancient desolate white wolf head-on. However, you haven't passed the test. If you want to use the blood-slaughtering demon sword, you'll only end up dead. Xing Xian's voice resounded. The last time you used the bloodlust demon sword, I suppressed the majority of its killing intent, so you didn't die. This time, if you use it again, even if you don't die, you will become a monster that only knows how to kill. After Xing Xian finished speaking, his voice disappeared. Hearing this, Chu Fengmian felt somewhat helpless. Previously, when facing the ancient desolate white wolf and escaping from it, Chu Fengmian had almost used all his trump cards. If he wanted to fight the ancient desolate white wolf head-on, his only chance was to use the blood-slaughtering demon sword. When Chu Fengmian attacked the Six Paths Demon Gates and faced Celestial Demon Supremacy, he had used the blood-slaughtering demon sword to kill Celestial Demon Supremacy. Although he had only used the power of the Bloodlust Demon sword once, Chu Fengmian knew that the power of the Bloodlust Demon sword was much stronger than many extreme Dao celestial weapons. If he used the blood-slaughtering demon sword, he might be able to fight the ancient desolate white wolf. Therefore, Chu Fengmian wanted to ask Xing Xian. However, after hearing Xing Xian's words, Chu Fengmian didn't dare to use the blood-slaughtering demon sword rashly. He didn't dare to disobey Xing Xian's warning. He didn't want to become a sword demon, a monster that only knew how to kill. Every time the blood-slaughtering demon sword appeared in the 9 regions, it would cause a storm of blood. Its former master would become a monster that only knew how to kill. Chu Fengmian didn't want to follow in their footsteps. However, if he didn't use the blood-slaughtering demon sword, Chu Fengmian wouldn't be able to defeat the ancient desolate white wolf. There must be a way to pass the test since it's called a test. Otherwise, Jian and I wouldn't have set such an impossible test. The purpose of the upper sword sex appearance and the upper sword execution token was to select a successor to inherit the upper sword sex sword skills. This stage was the last one. Although it seemed as difficult as ascending to the heavens, there must be a way to pass it. Otherwise, Jian and I wouldn't have spent so much effort to set up this test. Since it was a test, there must be a way to pass it. Let's go and take a look. After Chu Fengmian recovered from his injuries, he gradually approached the valley. This time, he took the risk to follow Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor into the valley. At least, Chu Fengmian was sure that the unparalleled sword art was in the cave deep in the valley. Moreover, there was an immortal monarch realm ancient desolate white wolf guarding it. Knowing this, Chu Fengmian could come up with a plan. There was no need for him to enter the valley rashly. Chu Fengmian carefully approached the valley and looked at the valley. Now that he knew that there was an ancient desolate white wolf hidden in the valley, he naturally had to be extra careful. Otherwise, if the ancient desolate white wolf chased after him, it wouldn't be easy for Chu Fengmian to escape from the ancient desolate white wolf. Chu Fengmian's luck wouldn't be so good every time. As Chu Fengmian approached the valley, there were 2 other figures carefully standing at the edge of the valley and looking at the valley. They were Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. Humph! When the 2 of them saw Chu Fengmian's arrival, their eyes revealed a bit of coldness. They had already guessed that Chu Fengmian had hidden himself and followed the 2 of them into the valley when Chu Fengmian rushed into the cave. Now, the 2 of them looked at Chu Fengmian with murderous intent. They couldn't wait to kill Chu Fengmian. Looking at the murderous intent in the eyes of Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor, Chu Fengmian's face was indifferent. Since they had already shed all pretense of cordiality, Chu Fengmian didn't care anymore. Once Chu Fengmian obtained the unparalleled sword art and the upper sword sex inheritance, the first thing he would do was to kill the 2 of them. End of chapter. Chapter 22:15. Putting aside the Flying Sword Emperor, Chu Fengmian and Xian Songtian represented the grudge between the Sword Dao sect and the Tianjian sect. The grudge was as deep as the sea and there was no possibility of reconciliation. No matter who it would be a disaster for the other party to obtain the unparalleled sword principle and the inheritance of the Sword Dao sect. No one would sit back and let the other party obtain the unparalleled sword principle. The atmosphere was extremely cold. Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor were all standing around the valley. Although everyone knew that the unparalleled sword principle was right in front of them, no one dared to go in and fight for it. Everyone had experienced the power of the ancient desolation white wolf before. However, they had barely managed to escape from the unparalleled sword principle. No one was willing to throw their lives away if they were not confident. I didn't expect the two of them to be able to escape alive. Chu Fengmian looked at Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor as he thought to himself. When he saw the ancient desolation White Wolf chasing after Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor, he was certain that the two of them would be buried in the ancient desolation White Wolf's stomach. However, he did not expect the two of them to be able to escape alive. One should know that Chu Fengmian was able to escape from the ancient desolate White Wolf because of the suppression of the heaven-devouring beast's bloodline. It was impossible for Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor to possess such means. Could it be that the ancient desolation White Wolf can't leave the valley? Chu Fengmian looked at Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor before looking at the valley again. Suddenly, his eyes emitted a strange light as if he had noticed something. With the strength of the ancient desolation White Wolf, Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor were all outside the valley. It was naturally impossible to hide from them. However, the ancient desolation White Wolf remained in front of the cave and did not move at all. It did not leave the valley at all. Moreover, when Chu Fengmian was observing the surroundings of the valley, the ancient desolation White Wolf did not appear. The ancient desolation White Wolf would only take action when it entered the valley. It was highly possible that the ancient desolation White Wolf was the guardian beast of the unparalleled sword principle and could not leave the valley. Let's give it a try. Thinking of this, Chu Fengmian's figure flashed and entered the valley. The moment Chu Fengmian entered the valley, a huge white figure suddenly pounced towards Chu Fengmian. It was the ancient desolation White Wolf. However, Chu Fengmian was already prepared. When he saw the ancient desolation White Wolf move, Chu Fengmian had already retreated out of the valley. Seeing Chu Fengmian leave the valley, the ancient desolate White Wolf coldly snorted. It looked at Chu Fengmian, but it didn't leave the valley and chased after Chu Fengmian. Looks like my guess is correct. The ancient desolate White Wolf cannot leave this valley. Chu Fengmian saw this scene and confirmed his guess. He was 80 to 90% correct. The primordial desolate White Wolf was either unable to leave the valley due to some restrictions, or it was unwilling to leave the valley unless it was absolutely necessary. No matter which point it was a good thing for Chu Fengmian. At least he didn't have to worry about the threat of the ancient desolate White Wolf outside the valley. Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor seemed to know this, so the two of them stood at the edge of the valley and looked at the ancient desolate White Wolf in the valley while chatting. The unparalleled sword principle was in the valley. As long as one entered the cave in the valley and snatched the unparalleled sword principle, it meant that one had passed the assessment of the Shang sword sect and obtained the inheritance of the Shang sword sect. He was only one step away from the ultimate goal. After this step, he would be able to reach the sky in a single bound. However, it was not an easy task to snatch the unparalleled sword principle from the ancient desolate White Wolf. It could even be said that it was extremely difficult. Chu Fengmian thought for a long time but still couldn't think of a way. It was almost impossible to fight the ancient desolate White Wolf head-on. Chu Fengmian knew this clearly. If he wanted to obtain the unparalleled sword principle, he could only think of a way to delay the ancient desolate White Wolf. He could only use his wits and not brute force. However, Chu Fengmian didn't have any ideas at the moment. Time passed by the minutes and seconds. Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor were all around the valley. They were motionless and seemed to be thinking of a solution. Boom! At this moment, from the deepest part of the valley, in the cave, a shocking sword essence erupted. This sword essence rushed into the 9 heavens. Above the 9 heavens, this sword essence turned into a 7-colored glow. This 7-colored glow could be seen clearly on the entire jade desolate star. The 7-colored glow has appeared. Chu Fengmian saw the appearance of the seven-colored glow and knew that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor would be arriving soon. Once the seven-colored glow appeared, the entire Jade Desolate Star could see it clearly. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor would be arriving soon. Although Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor had discovered the location of the unparalleled sword principle in advance, this opportunity was now gone. Within a few minutes after the seven-colored glow appeared, a ray of light flew over from afar. This ray of light was the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. He came to the surroundings of the valley and saw Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor at a glance. "The three of you are one step ahead of me," the Divine Wood Sword Emperor said with a smile. As the Divine Wood Sword Emperor spoke, he also descended into the surroundings of the valley. His gaze also looked into the valley and saw the white figure lying in front of the cave with a glance. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor could see the white beast that was thousands of feet long clearly. Ancient Desolation White Wolf? The moment he saw the Ancient Desolation White Wolf, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's face was extremely ugly. He looked at Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, the Flying Sword Emperor, and the others and immediately understood. Why were Chu Fengmian and the others around the valley but unwilling to enter it? This Ancient Desolation White Wolf was an invincible existence in the entire Jade Desolate Star. Whoever wanted to go against the Ancient Desolation White Wolf would only have a dead end. The voices fell silent again. Everyone was thinking about this countermeasure. Time passed by minute. This unparalleled sword principle is now guarded by the Ancient Desolation White Wolf. No matter who we are no match for this Ancient Desolation White Wolf in a one-on-one fight. If this continues, no one will have the chance to obtain the unparalleled sword principle. End of chapter. Chapter 22:16. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. The person who spoke was Xian Songtian. He looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and suddenly spoke. "Brother Divine Wood, why don't you join forces with us?" Join forces? The Divine Wood Sword Emperor's face was as cold as usual. He smiled and said after hearing that, "There is only one unparalleled sword principle and only one chance to obtain the upper sword sex inheritance." The Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not finish his sentence, but the meaning behind his words was very clear. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not want to give up on the upper sword sex inheritance and the unparalleled sword principle. The Flying Sword Emperor was willing to join forces with Xian Songtian because he knew that he did not have much chance to fight for the upper sword sex inheritance. Hence, he decided to join forces with Xian Songtian. Of course, there was another reason, which was Chu Fengmian. The Flying Sword Emperor had a grudge against Chu Fengmian, and so did Xian Songtian. If the two of them joined forces, they could deal with Chu Fengmian. However, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had no grudge against Chu Fengmian, and he was not willing to rely on the Tianjian sect to give up the upper sword sex inheritance. Naturally, he had no intention of joining forces. Even if the Divine Wood Sword Emperor could not obtain the unparalleled sword principle himself, he did not want to help others obtain it. "Brother Divine Wood, if that's the case, I will not force you." After being rejected, Xian Songtian did not continue to rope him in. He originally wanted to rope in the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and get him to lend him a hand so that he could obtain the unparalleled sword art, just like how he roped in the Flying Sword Emperor. Xian Songtian was born in the Tianjian sect. The Tianjian sect was a legendary sacred region sect that was extremely attractive to sword cultivators in the world. He also wanted to use the Tianjian sect to rope in the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. However, unlike the Flying Sword Emperor, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor still had the intention of obtaining the upper sword principle. Now, he naturally would not choose to join forces with Xian Songtian. With the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's attitude, Xian Songtian would not waste his breath. Everyone was thinking about how they could obtain the unparalleled sword technique. It was easy to obtain the unparalleled sword principle. As long as he could find an opportunity to stall the ancient desolation White Wolf, he could do it. However, while this was easy, it was also the most difficult part. The strength of the ancient desolate White Wolf was something that no one present could resist, let alone delay it. Why don't we rely on our own abilities? Chu Fengmian's mind was filled with countless ideas, but he wasn't confident that he could succeed. He looked over at the others and suddenly spoke. It was impossible for a single person to deal with the ancient desolate White Wolf. In order to deal with the ancient desolate White Wolf, they had to work together. What do you mean by relying on their own abilities? The Divine Wood Sword Emperor was the first to respond and said with some interest. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor was not willing to assist Xian Songtian and obtain the unparalleled sword technique, as Xian Songtian had intended. However, he was interested in Chu Fengmian's words. It's simple. We will work together and attack the valley. Although the ancient desolate White Wolf is powerful, there is only one of it. If we enter together, the ancient desolate White Wolf will not be able to stop all of us. At that time, we will have the opportunity to enter the cave and obtain the unparalleled sword technique. Chu Fengmian said calmly as he looked at Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. However, it was impossible for Chu Fengmian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor to snatch the unparalleled sword technique from the ancient desolate White Wolf. Now, he had to add the strength of Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. That's easy to say. Let's rely on our own abilities. However, if anyone goes in first, won't they be courting death? Xian Songtian said coldly after hearing Chu Fengmian's words. Why? Are you planning to make us all work for you? They were only one step away from the ultimate goal. After this step, they would reach the heavens in a single bound. However, it would not be easy to snatch the unparalleled sword technique from the ancient desolate White Wolf. It could even be said to be extremely difficult. Chu Fengmian pondered for a long time but could not come up with a solution. It was almost impossible to fight the ancient desolate White Wolf head-on. Chu Fengmian was clear about this. If he wanted to obtain the unparalleled sword technique, he could only think of a way to delay the ancient desolate White Wolf. He could only use his wits and not brute force. However, Chu Fengmian did not have any solution at the moment. Time ticked by. Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor were all around the valley. They were motionless as if they were thinking of a solution. Boom! At this moment, from the deepest part of the valley, in the cave, a shocking sword essence erupted. This sword essence rushed to the 9 heavens. Above the 9 heavens, this sword essence turned into a 7-colored ray of light. This 7-colored ray of light could be seen clearly on the entire jade desolate star. The 7-colored ray of light has appeared. When Chu Fengmian saw the appearance of the 7-colored ray of light, he knew that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor would be arriving soon. Once the 7-colored ray of light appeared, the entire jade desolate star would be able to see it clearly. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor would be arriving soon. Although Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor had discovered the location of the unparalleled sword technique in advance, this opportunity was now gone. Within a few minutes after the 7-colored ray of light appeared, a ray of light flew over from afar. This ray of light was the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. He came to the surroundings of the valley and saw Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor at a glance. The 3 of you are one step ahead of me, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor said with a smile. As the Divine Wood Sword Emperor spoke, he also descended into the surroundings of the valley. His gaze also looked into the valley and saw the white figure lying in front of the cave with a glance. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor could see the white beast that was thousands of feet long clearly. Ancient desolate White Wolf? The moment he saw the ancient desolate white wolf, the divine wood sword emperor's face was extremely ugly. He looked at Chu Fengmian, Xian Songtian, the flying sword emperor, and the others and immediately understood. Why were Chu Fengmian and the others around the valley but unwilling to enter it? This ancient desolate white wolf was an invincible existence on the entire jade desolate star. Whoever wanted to go against the ancient desolate white wolf would only have a dead end. The voices fell silent again. Everyone was thinking about this countermeasure. Time passed by minute by minute. This unparalleled sword technique is now guarded by the ancient desolate white wolf. No matter who we are no match for this ancient desolate white wolf in a one-on-one battle. If this continues, no one will have the chance to obtain the unparalleled sword technique. End of chapter. Chapter 22:17. With the sword intent of the Master of Sword Tao, it's enough to raise your strength by a lot. Hearing the Flying Sword Emperor's words, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's eyes involuntarily revealed a hint of greed. The most valuable treasure on Chu Fengmian, apart from the Sword Tao Sex Inheritance sword technique, was the Master of Sword Tao's sword intent. Previously in the 9 regions, Chu Fengmian was able to defeat the Black and White Young Lord and obtain the Supreme Sword Execution Token illustration. This was inseparable from the Master of Sword Tao's sword intent. The Lord of the Sword Tao was an invincible sovereign. Any sword cultivator would benefit immensely if they could comprehend even the slightest bit of the profundities of the sword intent he'd left behind. Not to mention that Chu Fengmian still had the Sword Tao Sex Inheritance sword technique. The Master of Sword Tao's sword intent alone was a Sword Tao treasure. Even the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was tempted. Why? You want to join forces to kill me? Chu Fengmian looked at the 3 people in front of him. Seeing that the 3 of them were about to join forces, Chu Fengmian did not look nervous at all. Joining forces is just courting death. If you're not afraid of death, you can give it a try. Chu Fengmian's tone was casual. Judging from his tone, he did not put the 3 of them in his eyes. When the Divine Wood Sword Emperor heard this tone, he frowned. He looked at Chu Fengmian with murderous intent in his eyes. Seeing this, Xian Songtian was overjoyed. He had been trying to rope in the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, but the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had not agreed. However, Chu Fengmian's words were like adding fuel to the fire. No expert would be willing to be looked down upon like this. Brother Divine Wood, this brat is arrogant. If he obtains the Supreme Sword Sex Inheritance, you and I will be in danger. Hurry up and kill him. Xian Songtian looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and said coldly, I promise you that after killing this brat, the Master of Sword Tao's sword intent will all belong to you. Alright. Hearing this, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not hesitate at all. He had always yearned for the Master of Sword Tao's sword essence. When he heard the Flying Sword Emperor's words, he was a little hesitant and doubtful. Now that Xian Songtian had spoken, he no longer doubted his word. With Xian Songtian's status, he would never lie to him at such a time. It's easy to break if you're too hard. No matter how talented you are, you'll still die. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor looked at Chu Fengmian with killing intent in his eyes. Chu Fengmian looked at the Divine Wood Sword Emperor indifferently. His expression did not change at all because the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian had joined forces. Really? It seems like you've chosen a dead end. Brother Shenmu, don't waste your breath on this brat. Just kill him. All of a sudden, hundreds and thousands of sword lights shot out from the Flying Sword Emperor's sword. His body had turned invisible. He merged with the thousands of sword lights and seemed to have turned into a sword, controlling the thousands of sword lights. Although the Flying Sword Emperor was not as powerful as Xian Songtian, He was not much weaker than Xian Songtian to be able to reach the final step of the upper sword sect assessment. The two sword lights suddenly slashed towards Chu Fengmian. Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had already accumulated their strength and were waiting for the opportunity to attack. In an instant they attacked and unleashed all the strength that they had accumulated. Buzz! The two sword lights descended. The sword aura filled the sky and turned the area within 100 miles into a sword world. Any living things that entered the sword world would be torn to shreds by the violent sword essence. Buzz! Buzz! The two sword lights shrouded the area and they were enough to crush everything. You want to compete with me in sword principle? Chu Fengmian sneered and sneered. He then pulled out the two swords from his hands. The moment Chu Fengmian held the two spiritual swords tightly, shocking sword aura shot up to the sky from Chu Fengmian's back. The power of the sword suppressed the power of the two sword lights in the sky. End of chapter. Chapter 22:18. The sword power that erupted from Chu Fengmian's body alone surpassed the combined sword power of Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor. This was Chu Fengmian's true strength. Even in the 9 regions, Chu Fengmian had never used his true strength before. Now that he was in Jade Desolate Star, the battle and energy fluctuations could not be transmitted to the outside world. To Chu Fengmian, it was enough for Chu Fengmian to use his full strength. After Chu Fengmian left Book Collection Pavilion, this was the first time he fought with someone after his strength had skyrocketed. At this moment, in Chu Fengmian's body, the countless sword skills that were recorded in the ancient book of sword principle turned into supreme sword intent and supported Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian looked at the two sword lights that descended from the sky and his eyes were cold. In terms of sword skills, Chu Fengmian was never afraid of anyone. Break it! Chu Fengmian roared. Thousands of sword intent erupted from his body and gathered on the sword blades in Chu Fengmian's hands. At this moment, he clasped his hands together and the two swords became one. Suddenly, the swords slashed towards the sky. The pure sword power that erupted from the sword blades soared into the sky. Boom! Boom! The two sword blades collided in the sky and the sky was filled with the sound of the sword whistling. Bam! In an instant, the two sword lights that were unleashed by Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor were crushed and destroyed in an instant. Boundless sword power suddenly turned into a sword aura river and swept towards Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor. Chu Fengmian had the upper hand even when he was fighting against two people. Xian Songtian's and Flying Sword Emperor's faces changed drastically. They desperately activated the power of the swords in their hands and threw out countless swords to resist the power of the sword chi river. However, their combined strength was far from being able to resist Chu Fengmian's full blow. 7 Jiu. Swoosh. However, at this moment, a sense of danger flashed across Chu Fengmian's mind and caused him to retreat continuously. Even the sword aura river that was condensed completely dissipated at this moment. A sword light suddenly slashed out from the depths of the void. The sword light came from Divine Wood Sword Emperor. When Chu Fengmian was chasing after Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor, Divine Wood Sword Emperor suddenly attacked. His figure entered the depths of the void and hid the sword light that was slashing towards Chu Fengmian. He suddenly reacted when he got close to Chu Fengmian. This sword light seemed ordinary, but each time he looked at it, it displayed a different stance. Sword of Great Omen. 7 Jiu. Chu Fengmian's expression abruptly changed. The might of this sword seemed to have exceeded his expectations. One sword was sword emperor was sword emperor's sword was sword emperor was swordsmanship sword. This move of the 7 fatalities required a large number of living beings to be refined with the blood of living beings. Only then could it unleash its true power. Because the sword technique was stained with the blood of millions of living beings, it was called the Great Ominous Sword. Even in the ancient times, the 7 fatalities was seen as a forbidden art. It was despised by sword cultivators, and no one was willing to cultivate it. Only sword cultivators who walked on demon Dao would cultivate sword emperor. Chu Fengmian didn't expect divine would sword emperor to know sword emperor. Furthermore, looking at the might of this sword light, the divine wood sword emperor had clearly cultivated this sword to the greater success stage. In order to cultivate sword 7 Jiu to great achievement, there were at least hundreds of millions of lives that had died under the power of the sword. From the outside, the divine wood sword emperor looked like an ordinary sword cultivator who was infatuated with the way of the sword. However, it was hard to imagine that the divine wood sword emperor had actually cultivated such a ferocious sword technique and even cultivated it to the great accomplishment stage. Not only Chu Fengmian, but even Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor were shocked when they saw the divine wood sword emperor unleashing the sword move. The moment Xian Songtian roped in divine wood sword emperor, he immediately attacked. He unsheathed the spiritual sword in his hand, and the sword flashed. Thousands of sword edges slashed towards Chu Fengmian from all directions. Xian Songtian unleashed the full power of this sword strike, intending to kill Chu Fengmian in one strike. The tip of the sword that contained endless killing intent descended from the sky. The entire valley was enveloped by endless sword intent, turning into a sword domain in an instant. All the trees within 100-mile radius were pulverized by the might of the sword. Xian Songtian's full power sword. Previously, Xian Songtian had never displayed his strength. However, he had passed the 9th level of the sword testing stone after all. Xian Songtian's strength was self-evident. Moreover, his cultivation realm was far beyond Chu Fengmian's. He was in the immortal general realm. With the strength of the immortal general realm, he was able to unleash such a terrifying sword intent. The power of the sword had surpassed most immortal lords and was close to the immortal king realm. Sword annihilation, Chu Fengmian muttered. What Xian Songtian used was the Sky Sword Sect's signature sword technique, the Flying Immortal Sky Sword Technique's killing move, One Sword Annihilation. This move was the move with the heaviest killing intent in the sword skill. It was an absolute killing move. The power of the sword enveloped the area and all life within 100 miles perished. Xian Songtian was not the only one. At this moment, the Flying Sword Emperor beside him also attacked. Although the Flying Sword Emperor's sword skill was not as powerful as Xian Songtian's sword annihilation, it still displayed his strength to the fullest. All of a sudden, hundreds and thousands of sword lights shot out from the Flying Sword Emperor's sword. His body had turned invisible. He merged with the thousands of sword lights, as if he had turned into the sword edge and controlled the thousands of sword lights. Although the Flying Sword Emperor's strength was not as great as Xian Songtian's, he was not much weaker than Xian Songtian's. The two sword lights suddenly slashed towards Chu Fengmian. Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor had already accumulated their strength and were waiting for the opportunity to attack. In an instant they attacked and unleashed all the strength that they had accumulated. Buzz! The two sword lights descended. The sword power filled the sky and turned the area within 100 miles into a sword world. Any life that entered the sword world would be torn to shreds by the violent sword intent. Buzz! Buzz! The two sword lights shrouded the area and they were enough to crush everything. You want to compete with me in sword skills? Chu Fengmian sneered disdainfully. He shouted coldly and pulled out the two swords from his hands. The moment Chu Fengmian held the two spiritual swords tightly. Shocking sword power shot up to the sky from Chu Fengmian's back. The power of the sword suppressed the power of the two sword lights in the sky. End of chapter. Chapter 22:19. The divine wood sword emperor let out a long roar as a shocking sword intent erupted from his back and instantly condensed into the spiritual sword in his hand. Boom! Boom! The aura of the divine wood sword emperor rose crazily as the power in his body skyrocketed step by step. The divine wood sword emperor, who had been hiding his strength, unleashed his full strength at this moment. Mysterious heaven realm. Immortal lord realm. The power that erupted from the divine wood sword emperor had far surpassed the level of the celestial realm and stepped into the mysterious heaven realm, the immortal lord realm. Even with the current strength of the divine wood sword emperor, he was already at the peak of the immortal lord realm. Peak of the immortal lord realm. This was the strength of the divine wood sword emperor. There had always been rumors that the strength of the divine wood sword emperor had already broken through the immortal general realm and stepped into the immortal lord realm. However, the true strength that the divine wood sword emperor displayed was even more powerful than the rumors. Peak of the immortal lord realm and the divine wood sword emperor's sword technique. His strength was almost comparable to an immortal king. Boom! The divine wood sword emperor raised the sword in his hand as thousands of immortal power sword intents were injected into it. Suddenly, a dazzling light shone as the sword slashed towards Chu Fengmian. The sword light was dazzling as it danced wildly in the sky. Thousands of immortal power sword intents were all condensed on the sword as it slashed towards Chu Fengmian. The power of this sword was much stronger than the combined power of Xian Songtian and the Flying Sword Emperor. Peak of the immortal lord realm. Chu Fengmian's expression changed abruptly. Although he had already guessed that the divine wood sword emperor was extremely terrifying, Chu Fengmian still did not expect his strength to reach such a level. The power of this sword was comparable to an immortal lord realm at the peak of the immortal lord realm. Such strength was not to be underestimated. Even in the sacred region where experts were as common as clouds, an immortal king was definitely an expert who could run amok in an area. The power of this sword was simply unstoppable even if dozens of immortal generals joined forces. Ordinary immortal generals would be swept away. Even Chu Fengmian's expression became incomparably serious. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian was already prepared. Chu Fengmian's bloodline power was fully activated. The illusory figures of the Xianjing and Tianlong congregated and fell into Chu Fengmian's sword. Dragon whale shatters the sea. The power of Xianjing and Tianlong, the two connate sacred beasts, gathered in Chu Fengmian's sword. The two forces blended in Chu Fengmian's hand and erupted in an instant. This move was none other than the dragon whale shattering the sea that Chu Fengmian had created with the power of the dragon whale. However, Chu Fengmian had integrated the previous fist technique into the ancient book of swordsmanship, turning it into a sword technique. Chu Fengmian was a sword cultivator. His swordsmanship was his strongest technique. Now, the dragon whale shattering the sea was executed with his swordsmanship. Its power was even greater than before. The dragon roared as a boundless and violent power swept through everything. The power of the dragon whale swept down and collided with the divine wood sword emperor's sword in the air. The power of this sword could be said to be the pinnacle of immortal technique. If it was in the hands of others, they would not be able to display such heaven-defying power. But now, Chu Fengmian had inherited the power of the two connate sacred beasts, Tianlong and Xianjing. The move that Chu Fengmian used was his strongest move. It carried the power of the two connate sacred beasts. Rumble! The sword formed by the dragon whale shattering the sea collided with the sword slashed by the divine wood sword emperor in the air, setting off a series of collisions. This sword that was comparable to an immortal king's attack was blocked by Chu Fengmian. The power of two connate sacred beasts. The divine wood sword emperor could also clearly feel the terrifying power that came from Chu Fengmian's bloodline. Chu Fengmian's concealment was far beyond his expectations. Sword sweeping 8 desolation. However, at this moment, the divine wood sword emperor was still extremely calm. After the sword was blocked, the divine wood sword emperor attacked again. The sword intent condensed into a sword light that was 10,000 feet long. It descended majestically and swept across the 8 desolation. As the sword swept down, even the 100 feet of space around Chu Fengmian was sucked in and shattered. Yin-yang reversal, 3 suns breaking the sky. Just as the sword light swept down, Chu Fengmian roared angrily. From behind him, an incomparably huge yin-yang formation suddenly appeared. The boundless and violent power that represented the strongest power in the world suddenly condensed in the sword in Chu Fengmian's hand. The sword suddenly slashed out. One of the Supreme Sword Sect's 12 Supreme Sword Techniques, the strongest move in the Yin-Yang Sword Codex. Chu Fengmian killed the sword spirit of the Yin-Yang Sword Codex in the library and integrated the Yin-Yang Sword Codex into the ancient sword technique. Now, Chu Fengmian could use it at any time. The vast and violent power slashed out along with Chu Fengmian's sword. The power of this sword was not weaker than the divine wood sword emperor's sword sweeping 8 desolation. When the two forces collided in the air, the aftermath was enough to kill some warriors in the celestial realm. A genius who can withstand 3 of my swords at the half-step celestial realm. I have never seen such a genius in the sword Dao. Seeing that the sword was neutralized, the divine wood sword emperor looked at Chu Fengmian. His eyes were filled with amazement. With his strength, even among the warriors and demon gods of the same realm, there were very few who could withstand 3 of his swords. Unfortunately, I can't let you live today. The divine wood sword emperor's eyes were extremely cold. He attacked again. He was a sword cultivator expert who had been famous for a long time in the extraterritorial starry sky. Each of his sword techniques had been cultivated to the level of great success. In an instant, the sword in his hand flashed again and again. Thousands of sword techniques slashed down in an instant. These thousands of sword techniques seemed different, but they were of the same origin. 1000 transformations sword technique. Chu Fengmian recognized the origin of this sword at a glance. The 1000 transformations sword art was a sword art created by the 1000 transformations sword sovereign, a famous sword art recorded in ancient records. He comprehended millions of sword arts and condensed them all into one sword art, which was the 1000 transformations sword art. The power of this sword was ever-changing. In some ancient books, the evaluation of the 1000 transformation sword technique was not inferior to the immortal emperor sword technique. Not only was the divine wood sword emperor unbelievably powerful, but the sword techniques he knew were as many as the stars in the sky. Every one of them had reached the level of great success. When this sword slashed down, it was comparable to thousands of sword technique. Obviously, this 1000 transformation sword technique had been comprehended to the level of great success in the hands of the divine wood sword emperor. End of chapter. Chapter 22:20. Thousands of sword edges fell from the sky. Now that the divine wood sword emperor had even used his trump card, he was bound to kill Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian retreated continuously. Even Chu Fengmian did not dare to take the sword edge head-on. Swoosh! At this moment, another beam of sword light suddenly appeared and slashed at Chu Fengmian from behind. Along with the sword light, a figure appeared. Xian Tsangtian. The sword edge in Xian Tsangtian's hand also condensed sword intent and suddenly burst out a shocking sword light. Flying immortal. Vast and mighty sword intent burst out from the sword edge in Xian Tsangtian's hand. At the same time, the flying sword emperor also attacked. A paper sword suddenly appeared in his hand. Although it was just a paper sword, when the flying sword emperor held the paper sword in his hand, the sword edge that burst out was not inferior to a real immortal artifact spiritual sword. The sword intent contained in it was even stronger and the sword power was vast and mighty. Vaguely, everyone present could clearly feel the shocking sword power contained within this paper sword. Although it was just a paper sword, the power that was displayed on it could be called a divine sword. Immortal Emperor Paper Sword. This is a paper sword that carries the Sword Emperor's sword intent. Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed as he recognized the origin of the paper sword at a glance. This paper sword was indeed made of ordinary paper, but it carried the sword intent of an invincible immortal emperor. Although there were not many such immortal emperor paper swords in history, they had appeared before. Some invincible immortal emperors wanted to pass down their sword will, but they were unwilling to forge a supreme immortal weapon. Hence, they would imprint their sword will on a paper sword. This paper sword could only allow one to comprehend the sword intent, but it did not have the power to fight unless the sword intent on it was unleashed. But in this way, if the sword intent on the paper sword was released, then it would be useless and become a piece of trash. From a supreme treasure to a piece of trash. The Flying Sword Monarch had made up his mind to kill Chu Fengmian at all costs. He took out an immortal emperor paper sword and unleashed the immortal emperor's sword intent it contained. The sword will was vast and mighty as it pressed down. Not only Chu Fengmian, but even Xian Songtian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were affected when they felt the sword intent. However, they were much better off than Chu Fengmian. After all, the target of the sword intent was Chu Fengmian. They were only affected by the aftermath. Under the suppression of this vast and mighty sword intent, Chu Fengmian found it extremely difficult to move. At this moment, the sword in Xian Songtian's hand slashed out. Sword chi condensed and as vast as the sea, it slashed towards Chu Fengmian's back. It was a pincer attack. Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Mysterious Firmament, Flying Sword Emperor. At this moment, the three sword cultivators all unleashed their full strength and used all their trump cards to besiege and kill Chu Fengmian. Tens of thousands of swords instantly trapped Chu Fengmian and tore his body apart. "Kid, you will definitely die today." Xian Songtian looked at Chu Fengmian ferociously. As for the Flying Sword Emperor and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, although they did not speak, they looked at Chu Fengmian as though they were looking at a dead man when they saw that he was surrounded by tens of thousands of swords. In their hearts, Chu Fengmian was definitely going to die this time around. Definitely going to die? Chu Fengmian roared with a cold gaze as he condensed his power to resist the attacks from the surrounding swords. Break! One sword, sky-splitting. Above Chu Fengmian's head, the ancient sword principle book suddenly appeared. The first page of the ancient sword principle book opened abruptly and the words 9 regions were written in it. Suddenly, boundless sword will was released from the ancient sword principle book and condensed on Chu Fengmian's sword. The ancient sword principle book was the condensation of Chu Fengmian's lifetime of sword will. It recorded tens of thousands of swords and Chu Fengmian had created his own sword principle from it. It was also his strongest sword. Sky-splitting. Chu Fengmian roared again and again. The two swords joined together and slashed out. A sword light suddenly burst out and released boundless sword power. The sword did not contain any technique but was purely power. It was a sword that could split heaven and earth apart. The first move of the 9 regions sword principle, sky-splitting. It was also the strongest sword that Chu Fengmian had created. Boom, boom, boom. The sword light suddenly slashed out and collided with the countless swords surrounding Chu Fengmian. In an instant, the tens of thousands of swords and countless sword will were shattered. The sword edge that was formed by the Flying Sword Emperor, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Songtian, the 3 sword cultivator experts, was torn apart bit by the sword. The power of the sword was worthy of the name sky-splitting. It could even tear heaven and earth apart, let alone a small sword. They watched as the sword edge was torn apart by the power of the heaven-splitting sword move. It was almost a hopeless situation. This sky-splitting sword had forcibly opened up an impossible path. Under the joint efforts of these 3 people, a gap was forcibly torn open in the sword edge condensed by these three people. Oh no! The Flying Sword Emperor Xian Songtian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's faces changed drastically. In the eyes of the three of them, Chu Fengmian was already a dead man. They did not expect Chu Fengmian to be able to tear a gap in the sword will that had enveloped them in such a hopeless situation. After a brief moment of surprise, the three of them immediately made their move. They immediately unleashed countless swords in the direction of that gap, and once again trapped Chu Fengmian within the encirclement of swords. You still want to trap me? Chu Fengmian's conveyance light was faster than their speed. In an instant, Chu Fengmian turned into a conveyance light and immediately got out of the sword. However, just as Chu Fengmian escaped from the sword's encirclement through the gap, the sky was suddenly filled with swords that slashed towards him. The swords that Xian Songtian, the Flying Sword Emperor and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had unleashed slashed towards him again. Although the swords were not as powerful as the previous ones, they still contained a great amount of power. Chu Fengmian saw the swords slashing towards him, but the conveyance light did not stop at all. He immediately rushed towards the swords. He also knew that if he were to fall into the encirclement of Xian Songtian, the Flying Sword Emperor and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor again, that would be the real danger. He could escape once, but he might not be able to escape a second time. End of chapter. Chapter 22-21. Even though there were thousands of swords in front of him, Chu Fengmian could only endure and pass through them. I am immortal! In Chu Fengmian's body, the 129,600 immortal crystals all gathered together and formed a huge crystal that could withstand all attack. His body showed some signs of crystallization, and the power of the immortal true body was pushed to the extreme. In an instant, Chu Fengmian turned into an escape light and rushed into the oncoming swords. Boom! 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 The swords bombarded Chu Fengmian's body, and the 129,600 immortal crystals in Chu Fengmian's body shook violently. Under the impact of the swords, they shook violently. Vaguely, the condensed invincible defense was about to shatter. Condense. Immortal stones burn. Reconstruct the true body. In an instant, Chu Fengmian's empty ring was opened abruptly, and all the immortal stones were taken out by Chu Fengmian. In an instant, they were burned and turned into extremely pure immortal power that poured into Chu Fengmian's body. Under the infusion of these immortal powers, some of the immortal crystals that were about to shatter were restored again. The swords slashed on Chu Fengmian's body, but now Chu Fengmian's physical body was able to withstand them. Let's go! Beyond these swords, Chu Fengmian's body did not stop at all, and in an instant, he turned into an escape light and flew away. Chase! Xian Songtian, the Flying Sword Emperor, and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor saw Chu Fengmian fly away, and in an instant, they also activated their escape light and chased after Chu Fengmian. This time, the three of them joined forces to besiege Chu Fengmian, and they had already made up their minds to kill him. Today, no matter where Chu Fengmian escaped to, they would continue to pursue and kill Chu Fengmian. Now that Chu Fengmian had turned into an escape light, they did not panic. Even if Chu Fengmian escaped, he would not be able to escape far, and could only stay on the Jade Desolate Star. The spirit arrays left behind by the Upper Sword sect above the Jade Desolate Star were not something they could pass through with their strength. Xian Songtian, Flying Sword Emperor, and the others had been fighting in this place, and they had also calculated this point. In this Jade Desolate Star, even if Chu Fengmian escaped, it would be useless. This brat took our swords head-on. He can't run far. Xian Songtian's eyes were cold and filled with killing intent. He could tell that even though Chu Fengmian had forcefully withstood their attacks, he had also sustained significant injuries. Even if the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were to forcefully resist such a sword edge, he would be severely injured. It was already beyond their expectations that Chu Fengmian could still use the escape light to escape. However, they were on the Jade Desolate Star. Although they had failed to kill Chu Fengmian, they were not in a hurry. After all, Chu Fengmian could not escape no matter what. As long as he was on the Jade Desolate Star, Chu Fengmian would always be their prey. Sooner or later, he would die in their hand. Chu Fengmian was well aware of this. In this Jade Desolate Star, no matter where Chu Fengmian escaped, it would be meaningless. Sooner or later, he would be caught by the three people again. The space around the Jade Desolate Star was completely sealed. Even if Chu Fengmian had the bloodline of ancestor Tianlong, it was impossible for him to break through the countless restrictions and formations left behind by the Upper Sword sect and escape. Chu Fengmian had long known this. His goal was very clear from the beginning. Chu Fengmian's escape light suddenly changed direction and flew in the direction of the valley. This valley was where the ancient desolate white wolf was located. What is this brat doing? Is he going to commit suicide? Looking in the direction of Chu Fengmian's escape light, Xian Songtian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were shocked. At this time, whoever dared to rush into the valley rashly was no different from courting death, not to mention that Chu Fengmian was seriously injured. Rushing into the valley at this time was simply delivering meat to the ancient desolate white wolf. It was a suicidal action. Oh no, this brat doesn't want the Sword Dao Sect's sword techniques to fall into our hands. In an instant, Xian Songtian understood Chu Fengmian's action and said anxiously, "Damn it! Stop him!" The Divine Wood Sword Emperor was anxious when he heard this. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor was willing to join forces with Xian Songtian to besiege Chu Fengmian because of the Sword Dao Sect's sword techniques and the sword intent of the Master of Sword Dao. However, if Chu Fengmian really entered the valley today and died in the hands of the ancient desolate white wolf, they would not be able to obtain any of these. In this way, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor would not be able to obtain anything after paying such a high price and using all their trump cards. Stop him! The Flying Sword Emperor was even more anxious. Compared to Xian Songtian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, he had paid a higher price. In order to deal with Chu Fengmian, he did not hesitate to use an Immortal Emperor paper sword. Now that the sword intent on the Immortal Emperor paper sword had completely dissipated, the Immortal Emperor paper sword had become a piece of trash. If he really could not obtain anything from Chu Fengmian, he would suffer a double loss this time. You want my swordsmanship? The sword intent of the Master of Sword Dao? Dream on. Chu Fengmian turned around and looked at the three people with anxious faces. The corners of his mouth curled into a sarcastic smile. His eyes revealed a hint of decisiveness as he rushed out of the valley at an extremely fast speed. What should we do? Seeing that Chu Fengmian was about to enter the valley, Xian Songtian's face kept changing. He did not want to give up on the Sword Dao Sect's inheritance that Chu Fengmian possessed. However, once he entered the valley, he would have to face the ancient desolate white wolf, which was extremely dangerous. He did not dare to rashly enter by himself. His gaze involuntarily turned towards the other two. Chase! The Divine Wood Sword Emperor roared and immediately chased after Chu Fengmian. He was also about to enter the valley. He had spent so much effort today, and he was not willing to return empty-handed. The Flying Sword Emperor did the same and immediately chased after Chu Fengmian. Seeing this, Xian Songtian did not hesitate and immediately activated his flying light. The three flying lights chased after Chu Fengmian all the way. Even when Chu Fengmian reached the edge of the valley, none of them slowed down. They had already made up their minds that even if Chu Fengmian wanted to enter the valley, they would still chase after Chu Fengmian. Seeing this, Chu Fengmian's lips curled into an imperceptible smile. His flying light suddenly flew into the valley. Roar! Just as Chu Fengmian's flying light entered the valley, A huge figure had already pounced on Chu Fengmian. It was the ancient, desolate white wolf. Calm. Wonderful Book House. Chapter 22. The speed of the ancient desolation white wolf was unimaginably fast. Just as Chu Fengmian flew into the valley, it suddenly pounced on Chu Fengmian. It opened its bloody mouth and tried to swallow Chu Fengmian. This wasn't Chu Fengmian's first time fighting the ancient desolation white wolf. However, Chu Fengmian was still taken aback by the speed of the ancient desolation white wolf. The moment the ancient desolation white wolf opened its mouth, it immediately used the law of space. The space around Chu Fengmian condensed. The moment the ancient desolation white wolf opened its mouth, it wanted to devour the space around Chu Fengmian. The power of this move was similar to the power of the sky-devouring secret technique. The ancient desolation white wolf possessed the bloodline of the sky-devouring beast and also inherited a part of the sky-devouring Tao. Even an immortal marquis would find it difficult to resist this devouring move. However, Chu Fengmian was already prepared the moment he entered the valley. The power of the bloodline of the sky-devouring beast erupted from his body, and a huge shadow of the sky-devouring beast appeared behind him. The moment the shadow of the sky-devouring beast appeared, Chu Fengmian felt the pressure around him lessen significantly. After all, the ancient desolation white wolf was a desolate beast. Even if its strength was far superior to Chu Fengmian's, the suppression of the bloodline couldn't be unaffected. Especially now that Chu Fengmian didn't just possess the bloodline of the sky-devouring beast. He had also fused the heart of the sky-devouring beast into his bloodline. Now that Chu Fengmian had control over the sky-devouring origin, he was like a small sky-devouring beast. Chu Fengmian could easily neutralize 90% of the power of the ancient desolation white wolf's devouring move and shatter it completely. In an instant, Chu Fengmian's figure flew past the ancient desolation white wolf. Chu Fengmian could use the power of the sky devouring to suppress the ancient desolation white wolf, but if he were to face it head-on, it would be no different from courting death. The moment the sky-devouring power temporarily suppressed the ancient desolation white wolf, Chu Fengmian immediately flew past it and into the depths of the valley. Roar! Seeing Chu Fengmian slip away from his side, the ancient desolate white wolf was enraged to the extreme. He felt that Chu Fengmian's strength was just like an ant in front of him. But now, Chu Fengmian had escaped from his hands again and again, which made him furious to the extreme. However, every time Chu Fengmian used the heaven-devouring origin source, the power of the bloodline would suppress him, making it impossible for him to stop Chu Fengmian. Just as the ancient desolate white wolf was about to chase after Chu Fengmian in anger, 3 streaks of light followed closely behind and rushed into the valley. However, right after they entered the ravine, what they saw was a furious ancient desolate white wolf. Not good! Get out! The moment they saw the ancient desolation white wolf, Xian Songtian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, and the others changed their minds and immediately prepared to leave the valley. However, right at that moment, an imprint platform suddenly enveloped the sky above the ravine. That imprint platform possessed the power to control the surrounding space. The entire ravine was controlled by the imprint platform and the surrounding space was completely sealed. That imprint platform was the life imprint. Just as Xian Songtian, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, and Flying Sword Emperor entered the ravine, the life imprint suddenly flew up and shrouded the ravine, sealing the space in the ravine. Chu Fengmian had been waiting for this moment. Chu Fengmian did not enter the ravine to seek his own death. His goal had always been the unparalleled sword principle. However, Chu Fengmian also knew that it was impossible for him to snatch the unparalleled sword principle from the ancient desolate white wolf by himself. Therefore, from the beginning, Chu Fengmian had planned to use Xian Songtian and the others to help Chu Fengmian obtain the life imprint. Although the ancient desolate white wolf was powerful, There was only one of it, and it could only deal with one martialist at a time. Now, Xian Songtian, Flying Sword Emperor, and Divine Wood Sword Emperor were all lured into the ravine. Chu Fengmian wanted them to delay the ancient desolate white wolf, so that Chu Fengmian would have a chance to snatch the unparalleled sword principle. Of course, it was impossible for Xian Songtian and the others to help Chu Fengmian willingly. Therefore, Chu Fengmian deliberately retreated and pretended to be weak. He wanted to lure Xian Songtian and the others into the ravine. Now that the three of them had been lured over, it was time to reel in the net. The life imprint had sealed the space around the ravine. It was easy for Xian Songtian and the others to enter the ravine, but it would be difficult for them to leave. Oh no, we fell into his trap. The three of them sensed that something was wrong when they saw the raging ancient desolate white wolf. Now that they saw the life imprint sealing the entire ravine, the three of them instantly understood that they had fallen into Chu Fengmian's trap. Chu Fengmian wanted them to tangle with the ancient desolate white wolf so that he could reap the benefits and snatch the unparalleled sword principle. Let's go. Let's leave the ravine. We can't let that kid succeed. Xian Songtian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor immediately understood. They turned around and prepared to leave the ravine. Once they left the ravine, the ancient desolate white wolf would definitely chase after the ancient desolate white wolf. They would rather give up the sword principle inheritance that Chu Fengmian had than watch Chu Fengmian obtain the unparalleled sword principle and the sword principle inheritance. However, they stopped when they were near the edge of the ravine. The entire ravine was enveloped by the life imprint. Although the sealing of the life imprint was nothing to them, Xian Songtian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were preparing to gather their power to break the sealing of the life imprint. However, at that moment a huge white figure had already charged over. The raging ancient desolate white wolf was about to tear and devour everyone in front of it. In its rage, it charged towards the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and the others. Danger! The Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Xian Songtian, and the Flying Sword Emperor activated their sword principle and immediately slashed towards the ancient desolate white wolf. However, the streaks of sword light were unable to withstand a single blow from the ancient desolate white wolf. The ancient desolate white wolf's huge wolf claws swept down and instantly, all the sword lights were shattered. Both Xian Songtian and Flying Sword Emperor took a few steps back as their faces turned pale. End of chapter. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.